Good afternoon. Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, my name is Val Ritchie. I'm the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings, and it's a privilege for me to open this session of the annual Human Dimension Implementation Meeting for a second year. This session will last 3 hours. The first section will be dedicated to my opening comments, technical information, and the remarks of the introducer. This will be followed by interventions from the floor. During the last 15 minutes, delegations of the OSCE will have the possibility to exercise their right of reply. If there is time, we will hear final reflections from the introducer, after which I will close the session. As a reminder, this event will be live streamed, but please no photographs or videotaping without explicit permission. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of this session is humanitarian issues and other commitments, and it provides a unique space for dialogue to take stock of current policies and practices, as well as to discuss the way forward in a spirit of shared responsibility. There are many intersections between the protection needs of refugees and displaced persons, as well as the persons at risk of displacement, and combating trafficking in human beings. Today's discussion will focus on how participating states can better identify, protect, and assist vulnerable groups, including women and girls, to decrease risks of exploitation and trafficking in human beings in the context of global migration. OSCE participating states are experiencing mixed flows of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers crossing their borders, including those who are in clear need of international protection, generating significant pressure on their migration and asylum systems. At the same time, vulnerable groups require special protection and should be identified as early as possible. Those who are victims of violence should be able to access essential services, including healthcare, trauma counseling, legal support, and access to justice, without fear of punishment, detention, or deportation. Thus, enhancing capacity and improving coordination among frontline operators is of paramount importance to effectively identify and protect trafficked persons along migration routes. That is one reason why my office initiated a pioneering simulation training course for identifying victims in migration flows and enhancing the capacity to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. Since 2017, this project has touched almost every one of the OSCE participating states and partners for cooperation. It is also important to note that trafficking in human beings remains deeply gendered. According to UNODC 2018 Global Report on Trafficking, women and girls represent 72% of detected victims globally. In the context of sexual exploitation, they represent 94% of detected victims, sexual exploitation remains the most commonly detected form of exploitation globally. Structural, social, and economic factors often perpetuate gender inequality and make migrant or displaced women and girls disproportionately affected by trafficking. The multiple and intersecting layers of vulnerabilities and discrimination may affect women and girls, in particular those from rural areas, living in poverty or out-of-school girls, and illiterate women. In addition, masculinity stereotypes create expectations that men should or are entitled to exert power to control women, in particular in relation to sex, but not only. As the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is drafting a general recommendation on trafficking of women and girls in the context of global migration, the specific emphasis on gender in today's session is timely and relevant. Likewise, the OSCE has recognized the importance of this issue. In Ministerial Council 1011, participating states committed to, among other things, incorporate gender aspects with particular attention to women in migration policies in order to prevent trafficking and re-trafficking. Building on this commitment, I invite you to recommend actions that can be undertaken by participating states, OSCE institutions, and other relevant actors to further implement these commitments. I would also like to mention that my office is currently developing practical guidance on gender-sensitive approaches to trafficking in human beings. This guidance will consider practical ways to mainstream gender-specific concerns with a view to better protecting trafficked women, men, girls, and boys, and also to enhance our targeted efforts to prevent and disrupt trafficking. I highlight this because the issues you will raise today in this room will certainly inform the elaboration of the policy and practical tools aimed at strengthening the implementation of participating states' commitments. Ladies and gentlemen, before I open the floor to participants registered on the speakers list, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our introducer for today's session, Professor Dalia Lenarte. Dalia is a recognized gender equality expert and defender of women's rights. She is the former chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and current chair of the CEDAW Working Group on General Recommendation Trafficking in Women and Girls in the Context of Global Migration. Dalia is also a consultant of the Interministerial Commission on Equal Opportunities of Women and Men at the Ministry of Social Security and Labor in Lithuania, and a member of the Working Group of the Community of Democracies Gender Equality at the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 2018, Apolitical magazine selected Dalia as one of the 100 most influential people in gender policy around the world. So I urge us to take note of what she tells us today. Dear Dalia, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ritchie, for introducing me to this ongoing conversation. And also, I would like to welcome all ladies and gentlemen here in this room. In the context of ongoing migration crisis, it's more than likely that among the migrants and refugees, many have been victims of trafficking already in their countries of origin, especially keeping in mind that a large number of who are from conflict zones in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and Middle East. In this regard, the situation of migrants, and more specifically refugee women, must be addressed as a matter of priority, as they face more serious challenges across all spheres of integration, including access to rights and protection. During their escape journeys, asylum seekers and migrants are exposed to additional risks of exploitation. One of the most dangerous places for them actually are hotspots. The hotspot is usually the first place where the vulnerability of refugees and migrants can be identified. This is where identification and registration of asylum seekers and migrants are conducted in the form of interviews. It is also at this stage where unaccompanied children are detected. For example, either 92% of children who arrived by the sea to Italy to 2016 and during the first 2 months in 2017 were unaccompanied. Theoretically, hotspots should be the first opportunity to identify victims of trafficking. However, it is not a case according to the latest report produced by the European Parliament on 9 main European hotspots in Greece, Italy, and despite that since the beginning of 2019, Greece has improved its referral mechanism significantly. However, hotspots in Greece remain overcrowded and living conditions in hotspots are difficult. It opens an increased possibility for abusers to traffic migrants, especially children and women, who are waiting for papers to be processed up to several months and longer. Also, many migrants who arrive from the so-called safe countries, like Tunisia, are classified as economic migrants rather than refugees and are automatically detained and returned to Turkey according to the agreement between Turkey and the EU. They are not even checked as possible victims of trafficking. In regards to mixed migration flows to Europe, the data available show that migrants and refugees are particularly at risk of trafficking in key transit points to Europe, including Libya. The dreadful situation of migrants and refugees crossing Libya has been described many times by NGOs and international organizations. In December last year, United Nations Support Mission and United Nations Office of High Commissioner for Refugees released an alarming report on unimaginable horrors faced by refugees in Libya, such as detention, gang rape, and slavery. The report details by crimes committed not only by traffickers and criminals, but also by government officials. Migrants and refugees are also remain very vulnerable when they go outside the hotspots and land somewhere in European countries. So now about solutions. I am a chair of a working group on a new general recommendation of CEDAW Committee on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration. Our work started last year, and during this period, the working group and myself, we had a lot of working meetings, seminars, and technical meetings with different agents who are trying to combat trafficking in human beings. And what we see, it's a huge fragmentation in combating this crime. I could introduce you here some summary of our meetings. For example, with European network of migrant women who we are trying to push CEDAW Committee, for example, to eliminate the term even migrant from the title of our new general recommendation, because supposedly the term migrant and trafficking are not compatible with each other. Then we are meeting a lot of NGOs, representative of civil societies, who represent sex workers in European countries and elsewhere in other regions. And these groups, again, they have a very isolated, I would say, and fragmented point of view towards issue of human trafficking, when they are completely focused on trafficking for sexual purposes and almost not recognizing other forms of modern slavery and trafficking in human beings. On the other hand, on the other side of issue, we are meeting representatives of civil society who represents Nordic model or so-called abolitionist point of view on prostitution. And again, they are focused on completely again on trafficking for sexual purposes, and are not very much helpful to support our work for CEDAW Committee on general recommendation when we want to have a coherent approach drafting general recommendation. Then we have a very powerful agents on this issue. These are specialized UN agencies, which some of them, they are pushing working group and CEDAW Committee to express very specific point of views regarding prostitution. And it was openly said during half day of discussion on general recommendation on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration this year in February. So how it would be possible, according to me, and maybe I can express the point of view of the whole CEDAW Committee, how it would be possible to fight this fragmentation while fighting trafficking in human beings, and more specifically in women and girls. I would say that we would need a monitoring mechanism, and this mechanism should be not only on the level of OSCE countries, but global mechanism. And in fact, such a monitoring mechanism right now, according to me, is the only one. It's CEDAW committee. We have Article 6, which address sexual exploitation and trafficking in women and girls. And using Article 6, member states, which are 189, can be, I can say, forced to be responsible what is done in their respective countries regarding fighting trafficking in human beings. So here I really would like to hear from representatives of respective countries, how do you see that CEDAW committee could be the very serious player representing such a monitoring mechanism regarding fighting trafficking in human beings? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dalia, for that comprehensive introduction to this topic and your really gigantic task ahead of you to write this recommendation. It's unenviable, but perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, we can use this session to offer some thoughts that could be helpful to Dalia, to be constructive, to contribute towards a way forward. This is the opportunity that sits before us today, and I hope that we take it. In a moment, I will open the floor to the speakers in the order of appearance on the list, which I will note is full and has a waiting list. I kindly request that participants introduce themselves first, including their name and organization. In order to allow for sufficient time for a fruitful discussion, interventions should be as brief as possible and not exceed 2.5 minutes. A few comments on procedure and format. I remind participants that interventions should be presented in an orderly and respectful manner, observing the time limit and focusing on recommendations related to the topic of this session. And in fact, our introducer has called for recommendations, so let's honor that. Criticism is welcome but should be constructive. We encourage you not to read out lengthy statements, but rather to submit them so they can be shared with everyone afterwards. Participants can only speak in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can take the floor. Points of order must relate to procedural matters. If it is a substantive issue to be addressed, the right of reply is the appropriate mechanism. A note on content. This conference is 2 weeks long. There are many opportunities for raising many different kinds of issues, but this session is on the important issues of combating trafficking in human beings, refugees, and displaced persons, as well as persons at risk of displacement. Let's honor those who have been exploited, who are vulnerable, who have been subject to abuse, by focusing on the assigned topics of this session. The goal of this session is to foster further implementation of OSCE commitments and to generate specific recommendations, because this is how we build better policy, better implementation, and achieve better outcomes. In this regard, I encourage you to begin your intervention with recommendations. With that, we will, in just a moment, turn to our first speaker from Amnesty International, followed by UNHCR. One moment, please. And with that, I will turn to Amnesty International. You have 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much to the introducer and to the participating states of the OSCE who are gathered here for focusing on this important issue. My name is Brian Griffey. I am a regional researcher and advisor for North America for Amnesty International. My colleague, who's also here in attendance, who is an advisor on the situation of human rights defenders, and I have just concluded a side event on the topic of migrant human rights defenders, which was looking at our main point of concern that we wanted to highlight now, and also offer recommendations in that regard in relation to a parallel aspect of the situation of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees and victims of smuggling and trafficking who have been exploited in the OSCE region on account of their very vulnerability on which participating states are focusing today. Amnesty International has been over the last several years documenting a pattern of abuses against migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, including at the hands of state authorities as well as non-state actors in the OSCE region. One thing that has increasingly drawn our concern over the last year has been a pattern of repression of those who have stepped up from civil society, namely migrant human rights defenders, in order to protect those vulnerable populations from abuse by government authorities where there are protection gaps and states have not filled those protection needs of vulnerable individuals. Just over the last year, Amnesty International has released reports on the dangerous situation facing migrant human rights defenders in Croatia, in France, in Calais region, and in the United States in a report issued in July, which have seen commonalities in the treatment of migrant human rights defenders in the EU space and in North America. And one of our cross-cutting recommendations, which we wish to present now for consideration of all OSCE participating states, is to ensure that the important protections of vulnerable groups against human trafficking and human smuggling are not misapplied as we have documented. We have seen how human smuggling provisions have been abused in this regard, and we call on all participating states to bar investigation and prosecution of human smuggling charges and those being applied to human rights defenders where there is not a financial or other gain recorded. Thank you very much.
I turn next to UNHCR, followed by the Church of Almighty God. Thank you for your focus on recommendations. Again, an emphasis on sticking to time. Thank you, UNHCR.
My name is Sophie Hofbauer. I work at the Liaison Office in Vienna. Distinguished Chairperson, dear participants, we have the sad duty to inform you that the trend of ever-increasing displacement continues. This unfortunately reflects failures in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, along shortcomings in the protection of human rights. During the past years, new and unresolved conflicts resulted in an unprecedented number of refugees and IDPs. Globally, 70.8 million people were displaced by end of 2018 as a result of conflict and violence, reaching the highest number again since World War II. The situation in the OSCE area mirrors these challenges. Last year, there were 12.4 million persons of concern to UNHCR. The conflicts in Ukraine and South Caucasus remain of key concern, as do the many casualties of refugees and migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. The dimension of these challenges requires international cooperation and more predictable responsibility and burden sharing, as outlined in the Global Compact on Refugees. In line with this, we would like to draw your attention to the first Global Refugee Forum in Geneva in December, which will offer the opportunity to translate principles into concrete actions. The framework offered by the Global Compact will also inform further cooperation between UNHCR and OSCE. Ongoing cooperation entails the following 4 areas. Firstly, collaboration in early warning, conflict prevention and resolution. In this context, we work closely with the OSCE Minsk Group, and we also assume the role as one of the co-moderators of Working Group 2 in the GID, and we are in close contact with the SMM on the ground. Secondly, on promotion of tolerance and non-discrimination, this includes reporting and combating hate speech and crimes against refugees in close cooperation with ODIHR. Thirdly, joint efforts have been initiated to assist states to facilitate the integration of migrants and refugees. And fourthly, we have joined forces to prevent and reduce statelessness in the framework of the Global I Belong campaign. In this context, particular attention has been given to national minorities such as Roma and Sinti. Causes of displacement today are complex, with new challenges developing dynamically. Climate change has been recognized by the UN as a new driver of displacement, which requires increased attention. Dialogue within the OSCE should be expanded to further assess the linkages between climate-related disasters, conflict and forced displacement, and to develop response strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Church of Almighty God, followed by Regional Center of Human Rights.
Thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Vivian Wang from the Church of Almighty God. I would like to thank the OSCE again for giving me the chance to speak here on behalf of the Church of Almighty God, CAG, asylum seekers in France. The Church of Almighty God, a Christian new religious movement founded in China in 1991, has been subjected to the brutal suppression and persecution by the Chinese Communist Party since its founding, which has resulted in at least 110 well-documented cases of death, and the death toll keeps rising. Some organ harvesting cases also have been recorded by NGOs. Under the brutal persecution, several thousands of CAG Christians fled to seek asylum overseas. We have appealed to the OSCE for 3 years about the precarious situation of CAG Christians in France, whose asylum applications have been rejected. However, the rate of asylum approval remains very low. Comparing to the approval rate of 100% in New Zealand and 73% in Canada, it is only 8.6% in France. Among 444 applicants there, 406 are rejected, and 236 have received departure orders. There have been several hard training cases. In January 2018, 2 CAG Christians were detained, and the prosecutors demanded their deportation back to China. Despite the vigorous support of human rights organizations, lawyers, and local priests, they were detained for 45 days, and a similar incident occurred this April. Thus, many other brothers and sisters in France live in fear. Now they don't dare to go outside or take the subway because they are afraid of being arrested by the French police and repatriated. Their daily life has been badly affected. In recent years, both the U.S. State Department and the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in their respective 2019 reports referred to the planned and organized persecution, torture, and extrajudicial killings of the CAG Christians in China. So, we respectfully urge the French authorities to abide by the non-refoulement principle and grant the CAG Christians asylum status. Meanwhile, we call for the support of the OSCE to guarantee our basic human rights in France and other participating states. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your efficient use of time. And Regional Center of Human Rights is next, followed by Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan.
Thank you. My name is Solana Fnaeva, and I'm representing Regional Center of Human Rights. The policy pursued by the Russian Federation on the occupied territory of Crimea causes mass displacement of Ukrainians living in the peninsula to mainland Ukraine and other countries. Those fleeing from Crimea to mainland Ukraine become internally displaced persons. Thus, RF is responsible for the generation of the influx of IDPs in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the occupation, over 36,000 Crimeans have left the peninsula for mainland Ukraine, and their number continues to grow. As we know, forcible transfer of population is considered as a crime against humanity according to the Rome Statute. And involuntary or forced means not only the presence of explicit decisions of the authorities, but also when the displacement was caused by policies and or practices compelling the population in issue to move. That includes cases when the state policies or practices did not state it as a deliberate purpose. That has been proven by the resolutions of PASE and Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This interpretation was also followed in the judgments of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In Crimea, in addition to the fear for their life, the destruction of housing and other circumstances that inextricably linked to war, several other indirect factors push Crimeans to flee. Among them, persecution on a religious basis, imposition of Russian citizenship, lack of fair trial, and others. So these policies and practices result in the movement of Crimeans, and therefore the environment of constant threat forced them to leave. The relevance of the problem has been repeatedly stressed at the international level. Nevertheless, there are still no acting mechanisms aimed at the inevitability of punishment of states compelling the population to flee. Therefore, we ask international society and intergovernmental bodies to plead Russia guilty to the forcible displacement, to condemn the policy of mass systematic human rights violation by Russia in Crimea, which leads to displacement, to adopt a resolution recognizing the responsibility of the RF for the influx of internally displaced persons from Crimea, to elaborate a compensation mechanism that will include compensations for both victims of the forced displacement for the injuries suffered in the state of Ukraine and international donors for the expenses incurred, and to develop standards and guidelines on how to protect people from forced displacement. More information is available in our information material. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll just remind all speakers that we welcome your empathy for the interpreters in the pace of your speaking. Next is Regional Center of Human Rights, followed by Human Rights Commission of, next is Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan, followed by Democracy and the Right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, distinguished participants. The Commission on Human Rights recommends to participating states of the OSCE and to their partners to study and take up the experience of the Commission on preparing human rights projects. The current problems of human rights defense is to put an end to human trafficking in Kazakhstan. Now, there are also rights of immigrants who are victims of human trafficking in Kazakhstan. The main issue of protecting all forms of immigrants and also to provide for repatriated people and stateless peoples and refugees in Kazakhstan. Based on the recommendations from all of these reports in Kazakhstan, certain measures have been undertaken. Human trafficking in Kazakhstan is not a mass occurrence. Every year, there are about 150 criminal cases. This is, of course, a violation of human rights, and civil society and the state bodies and human rights defenders pay specific attention to this. It is specifically based on the recommendation of these projects from the Commission. We have established criteria of cruel treatment that lead to social deprivation, and this is for people who are victims of human trafficking. Then standards were elaborated to provide special social services to the victims of trafficking in Kazakhstan. But there's one major recommendation which has not been implemented. That is to include in the list of people who have special services foreigners and immigrants who are working in Kazakhstan now. I will provide the other recommendations to ODIHR. And the Commission on Human Rights is opened to cooperate with all interested human rights organizations. That was about the exchange of experience. I also wanted to tell you about other important projects. 5 UN commissions based on the Kazakhstan Report on Human Rights, and the UN General Assembly and the U.S. State Department have all been working together for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Democracy on the Right is next, followed by Belgium on behalf of the European Union.
Tatiana Davlatova. I'm a citizen activist from Uzbekistan. Of late, in Uzbekistan, we've seen many instances of female minors going missing. The law enforcement authorities have refused to search for them. I have a statement and the power of authority from Ms. Saparova from one of the regions of Uzbekistan. Her daughter, who is a minor, left her home.
Speaking on behalf of that organization.
Yes, I am. Before that, 2 months earlier, 3 girls went missing from the village of Choshabe. However, the law enforcement authorities and public prosecutor's office have responded very aggressively. They've told parents that 14 girls have gone missing and that there's a queue. They've told them to get to the back of the line. The mother of one of these girls has been compelled to look for the girl all on her own. Furthermore, the law enforcement authorities have been very rude to the mothers, and they've offered no protection from the physical attacks which the mothers have been threatened with by aggressive, unidentified assailants. On the Uzbekistan Ministry of Internal Affairs website, there's a list of 2,623 missing people, but there are no teenagers, not a single one. Perhaps this is all related to the fact that there have been calls for the police to crack down on crime, and the police are whitewashing the statistics by refusing to register missing persons. Uzbekistan have signed up to international treaties aimed at combating trafficking in human beings. Our recommendations are as following. We need to come up with an algorithm, a plan for ways of finding minors missing in the OSCE region. We also need to unify search and investigation activities, taking into account intelligence agencies' experience. We also need a common mechanism for providing psychological, legal, and financial support to parents of missing children. We call on the Uzbek government to take urgent measures to find these missing girls and to conduct high-quality investigations. Perhaps it's going to be possible to find these children and to return them to their families. These situations are just like that film Changeling, in which Angelina Jolie starred. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Belgium, on behalf of the European Union, is next, followed by the International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm honored to speak today on behalf of the European Union. The following countries align with this statement: North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Moldova, Georgia, and Andorra. Trafficking in human beings is a grave human rights violation. It is a crime driven by demand for all forms of exploitation and by very high profits. Both within and outside the EU, the vast majority of trafficking victims are women and girls. The EU has in place an ambitious legal and policy framework aimed at combating human trafficking. The last European Commission progress report demonstrates improvements, especially related to cross-border collaboration, use of financial investigation, and developments of national and transnational referral mechanisms. Nevertheless, the phenomenon continues to evolve and remains characterized by impunity. Efficiently combating human trafficking requires participating states and civil society actors to join forces to enhance prevention and prosecution. The EU welcomes the commitments of the OSCE participating states for setting up a long-term common strategy and implementing the 2003 action plans and its 2013 addendum. The EU also emphasizes the importance of the Ministerial Council decisions adopted in Milan and Vienna. We very much encourage the policy to practice methodology of the Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator in assisting participating states with the implementation of these commitments. The EU calls for strengthened collaboration between the participating states with the view of improving the criminal justice response. We also encourage participating states to remain focused on the need for an effective and adapted protection to the victims, to provide specific assistance to the most vulnerable categories, and to facilitate the access to justice. In line with its comprehensive approach to security, the OSCE is a privileged forum to address the interaction between human trafficking and other current challenges, which cause, facilitate, or impact human trafficking practices. In particular, the EU is convinced that the OSCE can play an important role in implementing actions for decreasing the risk of human trafficking faced by asylum seekers, refugees, and internally displaced persons. With respect to forcibly displaced persons, the EU reiterates its call upon all participating states to comply with their obligation under the international law to increase and facilitate humanitarian assistance and to ensure the rights to safe, dignified, and voluntary return. A further version of this statement with all recommendations will be provided through document distribution. Thank you.
Thank you. International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe is next, followed by Charity Fund Right to Protection.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Our organization, International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe, has been established by and is led by sex workers. It is important to acknowledge that sex workers themselves build their resilience against violence, exploitation, and trafficking in human beings. Such efforts that keep sex workers resilient are often developed with no or limited funding. They are, however, rarely acknowledged by official anti-trafficking stakeholders as strategy worth to be supported. In contrary, anti-trafficking measures and policies do very often compromise sex workers' rights, as documented by numerous organizations. Conflation of trafficking with sex work and systematic exclusion of sex workers from anti-trafficking fora allow for greater collateral damage of some of the well-intended efforts to fight trafficking. Regardless of whether you agree or disagree with sex work as work, it is critical to evaluate the unintended effects of anti-trafficking measures on the most marginalized people. International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe calls for sex workers' inclusive anti-trafficking policies, stressing that sex workers are best positioned to prevent trafficking and to identify victims. Recommendations For OSCE ODIHR, it's important to make a step forward and to acknowledge the role of vulnerable communities such as migrant sex workers in building their resilience against exploitation and human trafficking in the upcoming reviewed National Referral Mechanism Handbook. As recognized by WHO, UNAIDS, UNDP, and others, where sex workers' communities are empowered, supported, and consulted, they can become strong allies for anti-trafficking efforts. Consider inclusion of sex workers' view in the review of the NRM handbook in order to achieve balanced and more nuanced recommendations for OSCE member states. For OSCE member states and Office of the Special Representative, Mr. Moderator, include sex workers and sex worker-led organizations into anti-trafficking policy development. Anti-trafficking policies would benefit from sex workers' in-depth knowledge of the dynamics of the sex industry and encourage them to directly report on the intended and unintended effects of these policies. And Office of the Special Representative particularly consider inclusion of sex workers' voice in the Alliance Expert Coordination Team. Finally,
Thank you. I'm sorry, your time is up. Thank you. Charity Fund, Right to Protection, followed by ADF International.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants of today's meeting. My name is Duringa Tolkish. I represent the fund Right to Defend, which works in Ukraine with internally displaced persons, people who are victims of conflicts, and refugees and stateless people. Every year, statistics presented by the UN Agency on Refugees Affairs is shocking. Every year, refugees or people who had no choice but to leave their homes are on the increase. Since the Second World War, nothing has jeopardized so much for democracies in the world as the situation as it stands now. It is the situation today which calls into question human rights and equality and the very principles on which democratic societies are founded. The current situation, in fact, is a major risk to rip away the protections that provide for the democracies as a whole, which are human values. It is also a very major risk, and the fact that certain governments feel like they can further undermine the most vulnerable people who have suffered the most. Ukraine, unfortunately, is not an exception to this rule. We would like to request that the OSCE should recommend to Ukraine the following: to eradicate discrimination against people who have suffered from conflicts and refugees in line with the basic rights. Internally displaced people need to enjoy all of their constitutional rights and enjoy all of the rights as other people, including the people who live on occupied territories, to also reinstate the rights of people who have had to leave their homes and uprooted from their lands and cannot vote back home and influence the politics back home. But the most important thing, the defense, which is the most important one that protects us from crises, are the norms of international law, territorial integrity and state sovereignty. I would like to remind you that it is the actions of the Russian Federation that have jeopardized the lives, health of millions of Ukrainians who had to flee their homes and to seek safety abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. ADF International, followed by Eastern Human Rights Group.
My name is Lydia Reeder. I represent ADF International. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of religion includes the freedom to change one's religion or belief. Yet individuals often find themselves being persecuted as a result of holding a particular belief or having converted to a different faith, and they are forced to flee their countries. The Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees thus identifies religion as a legitimate reason for being recognized as a refugee. The most recent displacement crisis evolving in the OSCE region has revealed flaws in practical matters regarding asylum seekers and refugees. One of these matters is how to assess the credibility of religious conversion in the asylum process. Authorities often find it difficult to assess the credibility in asylum claims, especially those involving conversion, as religion is perceived as a very sensitive and abstract subject. Furthermore, there is no uniform regulation on the subject across the OSCE area. It is not rare that the outcome of an asylum claim depends largely on the examiner's subjective perception of the religion in question. In many cases, the authorities tend to test religious knowledge and the intellectual ability of the applicants, instead of the genuineness of their belief and involvement in church life. This is what happened to Muhammad, an Iranian asylum seeker who converted to Christianity. His application was rejected by the British authorities because he could not name the 10 Commandments. The shortcomings of this approach are self-evident. On the one hand, it is possible to learn the answers without being genuine, and on the other hand, a genuine convert might not be able to answer correctly for a number of reasons. Therefore, questions asked by a caseworker can have a decisive impact on a person's application and consequently on his or her life. Regarding all of the above, ADF International strongly urges participating states to review their credibility assessment practices and to invest in the appropriate training of caseworkers. ADF International calls participating states to shift the focus from testing knowledge to acquiring personalized information about the applicant's religious identity, experiences, and way of life. Finally, ADF International urges the states to involve religious communities in better understanding the nature of religious conversion. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for focusing on recommendation. Next is Eastern Human Rights Group, followed by Karakal Pakistan News Channel.
Сейчас Ващуков Сергей, Восточная правозащитная группа.
Bashkov Sergey. I'm from the Eastern Human Rights Group. We work in the east of Ukraine and we work on human rights protection. In 2014, in Luhansk and Donetsk regions, there have been a lot of IDPs since then. As things stand, civil society and international organizations are helping them to find jobs, to set up companies. They're also helping the local population, not just IDPs. However, the government continues to ignore the rights of IDPs to housing, the right to vote, the right to work. Often, these are IDPs who now work in mines in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, areas which are not controlled by the government. Often, the miners don't get paid for their work, so they're forced to petition various bodies, including the courts. However, this does not resolve the issue. The only way for them to change things is to protest. This summer, each month, we had a wave of protests, following which the government decided to pay part of the wages to the miners, but not all. Nonetheless, the miners continue to work, although they are not being paid for their labor. At the state level, the issue of IDPs and their rights in these kinds of companies is simply not regulated. There are no rules. Often these people who have not been paid their wages, they are renters. So at any point in time, they can be out in the street as they don't have money to pay their rent. Sometimes they don't have enough to eat. I want to draw the attention of the international community, the Ukrainian government, to this problem, to the fact that the wages are not being paid to miners in the Donbas, and focusing specifically on IDPs. Please do something to fix the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Karakal Pakistan News Channel is next, followed by Bewegung gleich Möglichkeiten für allen.
Distinguished participants of the conference, what I'm going to tell you today will not only be a shock for you, it has already shocked all of us as well. When we filmed the reportage on the humanitarian catastrophe in Karlakapastan in the winter of this year, with our colleagues, we went to one of the garbage dumps in the city of Almaty, where about 5,000 Karlakapastan refugees were living with their children in slums. The reason is that the government of Uzbekistan is driving out our people from Karlakapastan. Around Almaty and Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan, we have assessed that there are over 10,000 refugees where the Uzbekistan government has seized their homes and have followed them, taken away their jobs, farms, cattle, and passports. Many had to flee due to political repressions. Every day, hundreds of families from Kazakhstan are displaced to these slums. The government of Kazakhstan knows well about these events. They show this on Kazakh television, and Shavkat Mirziyoyev is pretending that nothing is going on. Today, there a great deal of building going on in Kazakhstan, but it is Uzbeks from other regions who are being settled there. New companies are being opened, but it is Uzbeks who work there, who have also been brought from different regions. In one facility, a gas chemical site not far from Kurgangad, 95% are people from Uzbekistan. In 7 cities of Kazakhstan, even before Mirziyoyev came to power, it was people from Kazakhstan who lived there. There were practically no Uzbeks there. Since Mirziyoyev came to power, mass displacement of Uzbeks from Uzbekistan were brought to Kazakhstan. The local people in Kazakhstan are being simply driven out. The mayors of regions in Kazakhstan are outraged because they're told to go and live in Kazakhstan. Although all of the mayor's parties, deputies, head doctors, and other officials in the majority also come from Uzbekistan, hundreds of thousands of refugees have been stripped of their rights. They have no authorization to work, and they live in poverty. All of this has led to human trafficking and children who are being kidnapped for organ trafficking. Since Mirziyoyev came to power, children started to be kidnapped in Kazakhstan, a first in that part of the world. The law enforcement in Uzbekistan cover all of this up. We would like to make an official statement. The occupation policy of Mirziyoyev in Kazakhstan will result in millions, and if not tens of millions, of refugees. Unless Europe stops the government of Uzbekistan in order to reinstate the independence of Kazakhstan. For independence, we are ready. Thank you.
Bewegung gleich Möglichkeiten für allen is next, followed by public organization Human Rights of Crimea.
Good afternoon. Last year, I already spoke from this rostrum about the fact that in embassies of the Baltic states in the Central Asian countries, there's a great deal of corruption. However, my concerns were in fact borne out by the facts. What we saw is 140 Uzbek citizens were deported from Finland using forged documents. Our colleagues from Poland very often sent work visas to the Uzbek embassy. However, for some reason, that embassy has not given those work visas to them, even though we have firm offers from employers here in Poland. My colleagues told the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about the situation. They sent a letter, but nothing came of it because the corruption is so pervasive. Everyone who wants to leave the country is being monitored by the intelligence services. Sometimes they have to pay a bribe, several $1,000s. Basically, people who want to work in Europe work for bona fide employers. Well, they're not allowed to. 80% of migrants from Uzbekistan who are here, they in fact used forged documents. Therefore, what I recommend is that the embassies of Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland to conduct an investigation, or at least pinpoint why this is happening. Furthermore, I suggest that the representatives of the Uzbek delegation stop these provocations. During the break, Haji Akbar, your colleague, came up to me and started asking me questions about my organization. I, of course, am open to that. I gave all of the information he requested to him.
Uzbekistan.
We have no such person in our delegation.
Noted. Please continue. You have about 30 seconds.
Okay.
I gave him all of the information he asked for, and then he disappeared. So could we please do everything to avoid such incidents? Colleagues, we're open to collaboration, to cooperation with anyone and everyone, all sorts of structures. Let's roll up our sleeves and get down to work without trying to drum up tension. Thank you.
Thank you, and just take this opportunity to remind everybody of the focus of this session, as well as our plea for concrete recommendations to advance the topics of human trafficking, combating human trafficking, and refugees and persons at risk of displacement. Next, we recognize Public Organization Human Rights of Crimea, followed by United States of America.
My name is Damien Dminadirov. I'm from the Human Rights Protection Council in Crimea. Refugees in Ukraine. Russia is taking a tumble towards totalitarianism. Citizen activists are being persecuted. We have dissenters being arrested. Independent journalists are being hounded, and many of them are going to the Ukraine, which is charting course towards Euro integration and where human rights do matter. However, when asylum seekers try to apply for asylum, in fact, the Migration Service prevents them from doing so. In fact, the National Council for Security and Defense, which focuses on terrorist issues, has decreed that we need to fight terrorism, which is all well and good, but this has been taken literally by the Migration Service. So all asylum seekers from Central Asia who are of the Muslim faith are considered to be suspect. They see their applications get rejected. Often there are protracted court proceedings, and in the worst case, they are sent back to their countries of origin. Very often, asylum seekers see their applications rejected by the Migration Service. Then they petition the courts in Ukraine, and what the courts basically do is they do the Migration Service's job for them. As throughout the court proceeding, they take witness testimony, they look at whether repressions took place in the country of origin, and often they do rule in favor of the applicant. Also, there's discrimination against lawyers and human rights organizations who've taken up these cases. Let me give you a recent example. The Migration Service wrote to a disciplinary committee for lawyers with a request to strike that lawyer off the list of lawyers in the country. They're meddling, as you can see. We call on the international community and the delegation to somehow influence the situation, especially the way that the Migration Service takes decisions. The Migration Service needs to act in line with the legislation of the Ukraine. We don't want to amend the legislation. The legislation, in our view, is in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees. However, the Migration Service is flouting the rules. It's not acting as an executive. In fact, it's handed over all of its responsibilities to the judiciary. And what we're seeing is that many migrants are being sent back to their countries of origin where they're tortured, and all sorts of other abhorrent acts are going on. Thank you.
Thank you. United States of America, followed by Serbia.
Mr. Moderator, Roger Karstens, U.S. Delegation. The United States is committed to tackling the multidimensional threats faced by trafficking victims, refugees, and forcibly displaced persons. The OSCE can improve its collaborative approach to addressing these threats by partnering with participating states, non-governmental organizations, civil society, trade unions, and the business community. The International Labour Organization estimates that of the 40.3 million victims of human trafficking worldwide, 81% are trapped in forced labor. The U.S. Department of Labor's most recent list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor documents 148 goods from 76 countries. The September 2018 list of goods produced by child or forced labor cites exploitation in agricultural and extractive sectors in several OSCE participating states, including Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, Ukraine, and Russia. The U.S. report cites the exploitation of child labor in the production of pornography in Ukraine and the exploitation of child and forced labor in pornography production in Russia. On January 8, 2019, Congress passed the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2018, which reauthorized the United States whole-of-government response to fight human trafficking at home and abroad for another 4 years, including by holding traffickers accountable, protecting survivors, and preventing human traffickers, such as in foreign missions and diplomatic households. Turning to the topic of refugees and displaced persons, recent reports from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center have recorded 41.3 million people around the world experiencing internal displacement due to conflict and violence, the highest figure ever, with many of these individuals displaced within the OSCE region. The Russian Federation's occupation of Georgia's Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions has displaced over 280,000 Georgian citizens. 5 years of Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine have resulted in more than 1.4 million internally displaced persons, and at least 30,000 people fled Russia's occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, many of whom are Crimean Tatars. We are also concerned about how the human rights crisis in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is forcing members of Chinese Muslim minority groups to seek protection in some OSCE participating states. We urge all governments to carefully consider requests from asylum seekers affected by China's repressive campaign and to ensure the respect of the non-refoulement principle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is Serbia, followed by Political Movement Group 24.
Mr. Moderator, I would like to associate myself with the statement of the European Union and wish to speak in our national capacity on the topic of internally displaced peoples, a topic which is especially important for my country. I would like to present to you our proposal setting out to solve the housing problem of displaced peoples from Kosovo, emitted here through a regional approach. After the conflict in the Western Balkans in the 90s, were focused by international and regional efforts set out to resolve this problem. However, none have focused on the displaced people from Kosovo to Metohija. I would like to inform you that today there are 200,000 displaced people from Kosovo to Metohija in Serbia. Out of these, almost 69,000, or over 16,000 families, do need help. These are the latest figures from a 2018 joint survey with the High Commission of the United Nations together with Serbia. After 20 years of displacement, the rate of permanently returned people in Serbia is only 1.9%. There has been no sustained return to the province, nor with regard to providing for their human rights are guaranteed them. The restitution of rights does not exist in Kosovo and Metohija, for they are not guaranteed either by those who have committed themselves to do so, nor by those who are bound to ensure the restitution of these rights. We believe that a regional approach to the problem of the displaced people in Kosovo and Metohija are necessary, not only with regard to financial support, but also with regard to the effective implementation of the return and integration program under the auspices of the international community, of the OSCE, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. A regional initiative called the Skopje process has already been launched, and this could be a very good foundation for elaborating regional cooperation. Allow me now one final comment. Every year, Serbia provides about 500 housing solutions for IDPs financed by our national budget. At this rate, we will need about 33 years to take care of the most vulnerable part of our population. Are we going to have to wait over 30 years to solve this major problem? Thank you very much for your attention and for this opportunity to share Serbia's point of view on this very important issue.
Thank you. Next is Political Movement Group 24, followed by Institute of Young Democrats.
I am Nuruddin Rizoi from Tajikistan, representing here the Political Movement Group 24. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to take your attention to a very serious issue which needs a quick action. My speech will be addressed to the official delegation of the Republic of Poland. Our story is about asylum seeker who faces extradition from Poland to Tajikistan. Mr. Mustafa Hayatov is an activist of the Political Movement Group 24. In July 2016, after harassment in a sense of a danger to his life in Russia, he decided to escape to Europe. In August 2016, he arrived at Poland via the Ukrainian border and applied for asylum. He was participated in this meeting in September 2016. In 2017, his application was rejected twice by the Polish Immigration Service. After this, he decided to leave the country for Germany, but unfortunately, he was deported to Poland according to the Dublin Convention. In 23 of June 2018, when he arrived in Poland, he was arrested and taken to a closed camp in Grodziec, and he is already passing 1 year and 3 months. During this period, there were many attempts by several human rights organizations to release him, but unfortunately, all of this has failed. On August of this year, he decided to go on hunger strike for this situation for 10 days. His health worsened and he could not walk with his feet. Despite all that, there were no any results. His case has been rejected again by Department of Foreign Affairs and decided to deport him until 26th of this month. I visited him in camp yesterday. He is in a bad condition. Ladies and gentlemen, if this young activist deported to Tajikistan, surely his life will be in danger. He will be detained at least for 15 years. There are many examples. We kindly ask from the OSCE members to raise their voice and remind the Polish authorities of their obligations. We don't have more time. It's only 6 days left. I would like to leave a copy of the deportation documents to the Polish delegation in OSCE administration. Thank you for your attention.
Next is Institute of Young Democrats, followed by Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Спасибо, господин модератор.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Igina Hajiva. I'm from Azerbaijan. As a result of the occupation policy and the aggression being waged against Azerbaijan, we're heavily affected by IDPs, 1 million IDPs. This means that a tenth of our population has been forced to flee their homes. All of this began, of course, in Soviet times in 1988. At the start of the conflict, Azerbaijanis, roughly 200,000 of them, were expelled from Armenian territory, where they'd lived for centuries. They were forced to flee their homes. As you can understand, we're a fairly small country, so 1.2 IDPs and refugees is a lot. It means that for many years, 1 million people were forced to live in refugee camps. Women, children were stripped of the chance to live a happy life. Not just a happy life, but an ordinary life. A happy childhood without a care in the world. The right to education. All of those rights were taken away from them. As things stand, the government of Azerbaijan, with the support of international financial and humanitarian organizations, has built roughly 90 modern facilities for IDPs and refugees. The last refugee camp as such closed a little while ago. Nonetheless, the occupation policy hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. This means that in the occupied part of Azerbaijan, there is supposedly international humanitarian organizations operating. What do I mean? By this I mean that one OSCE participating state is directing financial resources, as well as other resources, to the objective of occupation of another OSCE participating state. I believe this is inadmissible. My recommendation is the following. We want the OSCE to control the situation in its participating states when humanitarian resources are being used for such purposes. Thank you very much.
Next is Malta, followed by the Smile of the Child.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Malta aligns itself with the statement delivered by Belgium on behalf of the European Union, but I wish to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Sadly, human trafficking continues to deprive millions of people worldwide of their fundamental human rights and dignity. In this regard, Malta joins other states in condemning this clear violation of fundamental rights. For this reason, Malta remains committed to suppress trafficking in human beings through effective initiative and legislation, as well as through efforts of prevention focused on awareness-raising campaigns and training activities aimed at combating human trafficking. To further enhance our common efforts towards combating trafficking in human beings, our delegation would like to present the following recommendations. Malta calls on participating states to adopt a victim-centered approach alongside the law enforcement approach, while placing the onus on the prevention of the crime. In this regard, the government of Malta aims to introduce a holistic national strategy on human trafficking, which would incorporate these elements by the end of 2019. In our view, this should be supplemented by the establishment and enhancement of anti-trafficking monitoring committees with the aim to provide a stronger oriented policy strategy. To further deter this despicable crime, we also call for an increase of the penalties for persons found guilty of human trafficking. Robust bilateral and regional agreements are also necessary to support each other by setting up mechanisms aimed at preventing human trafficking and the sharing of best practices. In addition, we must also ensure that border officials and civilian and immigration officers are equipped with the essential tools and training to recognize signs and indicators of trafficking. The Maltese government has recently announced that it will be joining the United Nations Blue Heart campaign and encourages all the other participating states which have not done so to join the campaign in a global effort to raise more awareness on human trafficking. Finally, recalling last year's ministerial decision on strengthening efforts to prevent and combat child trafficking, including of unaccompanied minors, my country remains committed to relentlessly work with the OSCE Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings to continue to finding solutions as well as building networks for collaborations with other stakeholders to effectively tackle human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Smile of the Child, followed by Kazakhstan.
Thank you, moderator. Mark van der Reek for the Smile of the Child, Greece. The Smile of the Child is the largest civil society organization in Greece in the field of child care and child protection. We are the national operator of helplines for children in need and the European hotline for missing children. We are also actively involved in search and rescue operations. In 2018, about 30% of our cases of missing children were migration related. Moreover, we run nationwide structures and tools to support children victimized by violence and poverty. In this context, we make a few recommendations. One, in the current environment of overwhelming migration issues, one tends to admit that local children are also falling victim to human trafficking. For the sake of identification of cases and adequate response, there needs to be more awareness of this among actors. Our organization runs sensitization programs with this purpose, and we shall continue doing so. Two, trafficking and exploitation risks also exist for children living abroad without being refugees or recent migrants. Their protection specifically requires a proper level of cooperation among authorities of the countries of residence and origin, based on mutual trust and, at least within the European space, on effectively implemented mutual recognition of judicial decisions. Three, in the context of the refugee and migration crisis, policy and effort remain very much focused on unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children. However, accompanied children also fall victim to trafficking and exploitation. We welcome the OSCE Decision 618, but we call for robust and comprehensive implementation by participating states in terms of prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. Four, it needs to be systematically restated in this broad international gathering that detention of children is under no circumstances and never acceptable. With this year's 30th anniversary of the UN Convention of Rights of the Child in mind, we must ensure that the migration phenomenon, the cost it entails and the security concerns it provokes will not be allowed to dethrone human rights and fundamental children's rights from being a cornerstone value in our societies. Unfortunately, however, we cannot but notice that the recognition of children's rights in policy making, let alone in effective implementation, is really not to be taken for granted. Thank you very much.
Next is Kazakhstan, followed by NGO NAM.
Good afternoon. I represent Kazakhstan and the fund Radnik. For 13 years, we have been presenting assistance.
I'm sorry. Yes, this was a call for the representative of the Republic of Kazakhstan.
Да, сейчас выступает делегация.
This is the official delegation of Kazakhstan who's to speak. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. Today in Kazakhstan, we have established a very effective system to counter human trafficking, which is being updated all the time. Kazakhstan is a participant of over 60 multilateral universal treaties on human rights, including 13 international conventions and treaties, which are directly linked to countering the modern form of slavery. In 3 years, the law enforcement has started over 3,000 cases on human trafficking. We have curtailed the work of 60 organized crime groups who exploit people and traffic them. We have put an end to 7 channels that bring people abroad to exploit them. We have 5 government plans to prevent all forms of crime, including human trafficking. We have a program of cooperation of CIS states in combating human trafficking and an interstate program and measures to combat organized crime. We have a commission on the issue of illegal trafficking of people with 14 state agencies of the country and 7 NGOs. Protecting and helping victims of trafficking is provided for by the agencies. The rehabilitation of victims of trafficking is based on criteria and standards of providing them with social services and assistance. According to the law on special social services, a person is deemed to be a victim of trafficking whether or not there has been a case brought on his behalf. The victims of trafficking dealing with this issue go through NGOs, and they are provided for 93.5 million tenge for these programs. And next year, this will rise to 160 million tenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is NGO NAM, followed by Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety.
Lyudmila Petohova. I'm the head of Lenam, that NGO. Ashgabat's the Ashgabat NGO's activities aimed at combating trafficking in human persons. Since 2010, we've had a hotline, and it's been working 24/7. The objective of this hotline is to prevent and combat illegal immigration as well as human trafficking. We also want to help victims of human trafficking with the help of the International Organization for Migration. We take calls in the Turkmen language and also in Russian. Over the last decade, the hotline has provided information and support to over 20,000 people who rang our number. Since it was set up, the call center has not come across a single instance of human trafficking on the territory of Turkmenistan. So when we do see reports about the fact that in Turkmenistan slave labor is used to harvest cotton, well, we're baffled by this. What we have found is that there are some victims of human trafficking, and we help them to reintegrate into society. We support their rehabilitation. A key pillar of this process are international organizations and also government organizations, although not all of the calls we get are corroborated. We have also run a major information campaign. We've disseminated and distributed all sorts of materials, put ads in the main newspapers, advertising our hotline, very often in all of the airports in Turkmenistan, as well as in places where airline tickets are sold. We have screens which advertise our services. We also have a national plan of action for combating the trafficking in human beings. We have a website as well. We are funded by grants. We get grants from USAID, from IOM, and we'd like to secure the support of the OSCE so as to be able to extend further assistance to those in need. All the more so that what we're seeing is that some Turkmenistanis will be returning soon from Syria and other hotspots. So we call on the OSCE to cooperate with us. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to take this moment to remind participants, please no photography or video unless explicit permission is granted. Next, Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, followed by Ukraine.
As a result of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the territories of Azerbaijan were occupied about 100, but in the early 90s, we had about 1 million refugees and IDPs. This conflict has led to a great deal of suffering for the people of Azerbaijan. But I also wanted to note that corrupted officials have once again built their corruption pyramids, and the Vice Premier Ali Ghassanov, who for the past 10 years headed the Committee on Assistance to Refugees, has turned into one of the most glaring oligarchs. This has led to the fact that his grandson had a car collection, and he boasted on this on the Instagram, posting his multi-million collection of cars, while people had to suffer. The money he spent on buying cars, tens of thousands of families could have been provided with urgent assistance that they needed. We call on the authorities of Azerbaijan to be transparent in order to provide assistance to our refugees, which make up 10% of our population. I would remind you that as of today, since the creation of the Azerbaijan Oil Fund from 2005 up to today, they have spent something like $2 billion to improve the social economic situation of refugees. These funds need to be spent on the refugees. About 300,000 Azerbaijani citizens over the past 15 years have had to flee the current totalitarian regime of Aliyev. They are in political immigration abroad. We call on the authorities to put an end to the repressions in the country, to start to create the democratic transition of power in the country, to stop intimidating the migrants who are now in Western Europe and who are calling for democratization of Azerbaijan. We call on participating states who have given refugee status to our people to protect these asylum seekers, because certain rights defenders and journalists living abroad are still under intimidation and threat of Azerbaijan. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.
Next is Ukraine, followed by the Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sergei Nizhinsky, Deputy Minister for Social Policy, Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine has acceded to all major international anti-human trafficking legal acts and adopted relevant national legislation. Another state social program for combating trafficking in human beings has been adopted and is being implemented. A system for combating human trafficking was created in Ukraine. Interaction of key actors of the national cooperation mechanism was ensured. We have increased the number of identified victims of human trafficking and provided assistance to them. In 2018, 221 citizens were granted the status of a person affected by human trafficking, which is 11.6% higher than in 2017, 198. Law enforcement agencies have stepped up to solve crimes related to trafficking in human beings, and the government is working on opening an all-Ukrainian center for victims of trafficking in human beings. The illegal occupation of part of Ukraine by Russian Federation results in the inability of the Ukrainian authorities to respond to human rights abuse in territories which are not controlled by Ukraine. Ukraine is concerned that it cannot protect the right of its citizens because of the government of the Russian Federation violates the norms of international legal acts. Today in Ukraine, almost 1.4 million people have become internally displaced persons. It caused loss of job, income, and property. In this case, the government adopted the strategy of international integrity displaced person and implementation of long-term solution to internal displacement aimed to increase the level and quality of life of internally displaced person. In view of the above mentioned, Ukraine appeals to OSCE and all participant countries and partner country to struggle against this issue together, because it is not only a problem for Ukraine. Ukraine appeals to consolidate efforts in order to develop new mechanisms for the protection of citizens' rights. Thank you for attention.
Thank you. Next is Azerbaijani community of the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, followed by Human Rights Without Frontiers.
Thank you. Mr. Chairperson.
Excuse me, just a moment. Point of order, Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that according to the list of participants, this speaker has been registered as a member of the delegation of Azerbaijan. And it's quite surprising that he's now trying to speak as a civil society. It means that either he has to be denied the right to speak, or he has to take the seat of delegation of Azerbaijan. Thank you.
One moment, please. We'll have a short technical break. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of maximizing the use of our time, we're going to pause this speaker for a few moments and move to the next speaker, and we'll address it. So it will be resolved. Point of order from Azerbaijan.
Mr. Moderator, I would like to clarify this issue. I waited that Odir will clarify, but it seems that I need. So, according to the list of participants, provisional list of participants circulated on 12 September, two delegates one from the National Human Rights Institution of Azerbaijan and two persons from the NGO were listed in the list of delegates of Azerbaijan. Consequently, on the same day, we sent an email to the ODIHR indicating that there is two technical mistakes in the list of participants. And the email received, also we mentioned to clarify this issue before the H team in order not to create the confusion with regard to the status of speakers. And we received an email from the ODIHR that on the same date, these two persons, two persons from the NGO, which was currently going to speak, and one person from the Ombudsman Apparat of Azerbaijan, who already spoke a couple of times during this session in the Human Rights seat. So these two persons were technically listed in the list of delegates of Azerbaijan, and ODIHR said that they will clarify this issue. And coming to the Armenian point of order, it seems that they haven't raised the same issue with regard to the Ombudsman representative. They have this bias against our NGO.
We'll take one point of order at a time, but thank you for the additional information. A short pause. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to proceed with the next speaker while we further explore the information that's been provided to make sure that each delegation's rights are protected. And we will come back to you on that in a few moments. But next we are going to go to Human Rights Without Frontiers.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Just a moment, please. Point of order.
Mr. Moderator, I kindly ask to look to the badge of our representative. He was given the badge of NGO. Now, it was clarified during the registration, and now in this hall we are saying that the status of our representative is not clear. So can you give the clarification on that? So why, if the issue was clarified before the meeting and he was given the NGO badge, now in this hall we are arguing whether it is a state representative or NGO representative. I don't understand why we need to clarify this issue further. He must give in the floor according to his badge and according to his registration.
Thank you for the additional information. We are not arguing. We are trying to further explore and to make sure that we have all the facts straight. Your point is duly noted. We will come back to it in a few moments once we have additional information. Thank you very much. Human Rights Without Frontiers.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. An unprecedented level of state repression against all religions and believers has been raging and escalating month after month in China since Xi Jinping has made sure he will be president for life. Believers belonging to mainline or well-known religions in China are usually granted political asylum when they come to Europe, but the world map of religions reveals an infinite diversity of belief systems, and people who are dear to non-mainline religions are also protected by the Universal Declaration. One of the most persecuted movements in China is the Church of Almighty God, which has several million members according to the Chinese authorities themselves. Our organization has a database of over 4,000 documented cases of religious prisoners in the world. More than 2,000 are Chinese believers of that church, and it is only the tip of the iceberg. As of the 1st of September of this year, over 2,300 believers of this church were looking for a safe haven in 15 European countries. Italy, Belgium, France, Germany, and Switzerland were the countries who rejected the highest number of applications for asylum. If deported back to China, they would be arrested and imprisoned. We congratulate Canada, Finland, and Sweden for their good practices on this issue, for their enlightened management of the applications for asylum introduced by people of that church fleeing religious persecution in China. We recommend that these three countries share their experience about this particular group with the delegations of the other participating states of the OSCE, including EU countries and Switzerland. We recommend, finally, that OSCE participating states give serious and fair consideration to religion-based asylum requests by Chinese refugees, including those from the Church of Almighty God, and that nobody should be deported without seriously evaluating the risks he or she would face in China, which may include incarceration, torture, and even death. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And next, and I apologize for not giving a heads up on this, next will be Holy See, followed by NGO Yenmi.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm here representing the NGO Yenmi.
Next is Holy See, then followed by Yenmi. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Trafficking in human beings is a grave and profound wound to human dignity and to universal human rights, and it continues to represent a major challenge to our region. In a message of the 2nd February this year, Pope Francis stressed that, I quote, "Although we try to ignore it, slavery is not something from other times. Faced with this tragic reality, no one can wash their hands of it without being, in some way, an accomplice to this crime against humanity. We cannot ignore the fact that there is as much slavery in the world today as there was before, or perhaps more. Therefore, it is vital that combating trafficking in human beings remains high on the OSCE agenda. The Holy See was pleased to join consensus on MC Decision number 618, strengthening efforts to prevent and combat child trafficking, including of unaccompanied minors, adopted last year in Milan. On the issues related to migration and on refugees and displaced persons, the OSCE recognizes the leading role of the United Nations. This in no way denies the OSCE key complementary role, but stresses rather the importance of the OSCE focusing on its specific capabilities and strengths, and avoids simply duplicating what is done by other actors, a point that the Holy See has repeatedly made. In particular, there are a number of crucial human dimension issues where the OSCE should give greater attention to the plight of migrants, refugees, and displaced persons. This would include the right to life, the rule of law, freedom of religion or belief, as well as specific consideration on the family, notably family reunification, highlighted even in the Helsinki Final Act, as well as women and children. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the next speaker, since we're about halfway through the speakers list, I just wanted to take a moment and highlight a few of the themes that have come through from some of the speakers. First of all, I've heard a call for cooperation and partnership from a number of speakers, and that's an excellent suggestion and one worthy of consideration. A call for increased identification and do no harm in how we interact with persons who are in positions of vulnerability. A specific focus on various issues, thematic issues such as labor exploitation, pornography, and children, and their specific vulnerabilities. What I would call for and urge speakers to consider is how we can offer some recommendations on some of the specific themes mentioned in the annotated agenda, specifically how participating states can better detect, identify, protect, and assist vulnerable groups, including women and girls, to decrease risks of gender-based violence and trafficking in human beings. Specifically, this gender angle that has been highlighted in some of the concept notes as well as the presentation by our introducer. So with that pause and that reflection on where we stand halfway through this session, I next move to NGO Yenmi, followed by Center for Social Psychological Rehabilitation and Adaptation for Women and Children, Rodnick.
Thank you. Considering the important role played by civil society organizations in helping these vulnerable groups, it must be said that this is a key component of the development of a democratic society in Turkmenistan. Thanks to our organization's fruitful cooperation with the state sector, business, international bodies, we've managed to fine-tune the partnerships which we're working on, ways of cooperating with one another. We provide social assistance to the most vulnerable. We help them to adapt, to reintegrate into society. I, as a person with a disability, believe it's very valuable and important for me to represent people with disabilities. However, as I'm here representing a slightly different civil society organization, I represent civil society in my country as a whole. The way that the title of my organization translates from Turkmen means overcoming challenges, and we work in a whole host of areas. As I said, adaptation, social assistance to vulnerable groups. This means that we can provide equal opportunities for disadvantaged groups. We focus on people such as the elderly, people with disabilities. We work on gender aspects. We fight human trafficking. In order to promote gender equality, we need to do a number of things, and this will help also women with disabilities to reach their full potential. We have shelters where people who have fallen victim to human trafficking can stay and then reintegrate into mainstream society. In the shelters, there are conditions conducive to reintegration into society. Volunteers working for our organization run outreach and advocacy campaigns, especially targeting groups who might be thinking of traveling outside the country. We also have a special task force for combating human trafficking. A national plan of action has been prepared by that group and a new law on combating human trafficking. It is this kind of intersectoral cooperation that lays the foundations for the success of our organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Center for Social and Psychological Rehabilitation and Adaptation for Women and Children, or RODNIC, followed by Independent Human Rights Protectors.
Thank you very much. I represent Kazakhstan. For 13 years in our center, we have had a shelter. For 15 years, we've been working in the area of countering trafficking in human beings. And it must be said that 2019 has had many events to counter human trafficking. We have held the second training and seminar with the support of the OSCE office in Vienna and the General Procurator's office. We have had 17 participating states in these training workshops. And the results of the latest training, the effect for our organization, of associations for Uzbekistan, 15 people, victims of trafficking, have returned to their countries. We thank the Vienna office of the OSCE in providing us with the model for training, because in Nur-Sultan this year, in mid-October, we will hold our first national training exercise to combat human trafficking. This will include all of our partners from Kazakhstan who work in this sphere. We would like to thank the OSCE office in Nur-Sultan for this important initiative. This year, we held our first training for airline companies. This is also some new know-how that we have in our country. We already have some feedback from the airline companies and the security services with regard to this training for the profilers of the airline companies. Another major challenge that we are clearly facing, and that is recruiting victims through the internet. Now, with the participation of the OSCE office in Nur-Sultan, the United States Embassy, the General Prosecutor's Office of the Ministry of the Interior is also holding training workshops for law enforcement agents and those who work in the General Prosecutor's Office. However, I would like to also note the following. We have already heard this here before. We are a country of destination, and foreigners cannot get assistance in our shelters. To provide shelters and assistance to victims, one needs to be from our country. We would like to see that when we have labor exploitation cases, we would need to see the number of these cases grow, because we are a country of destination. Each time we have a case of human trafficking, thank you.
We welcome written submissions as well. Next is Independent Human Rights Protectors, followed by Eurasian Dialogue Institution.
Thank you, moderator, for giving me the floor. I'm Hadir Mazova. I'm a lawyer from Tajikistan, and I'm a human rights defender. Ladies and gentlemen, traditionally, we have been a settled people, but now we've been forced to travel around the world. No one is quite sure how many Tajikistanis there are outside the country. According to the Russian Migration Service, there are at least 200,000 Tajikistanis in Russia. Tajikistanis outside the country and other CIS migrants are considered to be labor migrants. But that's not quite the case. For the most part, they're basically refugees because they faced imprisonment, deportation, and torture in their home countries. Just over the last year, in fact, the Russian Federation sent at least 2 members of the Islamic Renaissance Party and members of the Group 24. So they were sent back to Tajikistan despite the fact that they face various threats there. The main problem for our migrants is the requirement for them to register in their place of residence, and it's very difficult for them to register. It's been said on a number of occasions that sometimes people end up behind bars simply because they like a post on social media. Also, some people have fled the country to avoid the draft, and here the situation is also quite complicated. Very often, these people are forced to flee because of the fact that they might be conscripted. So many of these migrants are, in fact, refugees. They're seeking asylum. They're not asking for any kind of special privileges. They just want to live their lives, get on with their lives, but also to be free. However, they remain at risk. Furthermore, the number of Tajikistanis seeking asylum in Europe and the US is growing, although we don't always get a warm welcome. No one's waiting there for us. Recently, members of Group 24, specifically Mr. Fakharutov, was forced to go on hunger strike because he is being detained in a closed facility in Poland. He's been there for a year and a half. He's likely to be deported and then tortured. I have a court judgment here, and it states that he can only be held there up until the 26th of September. Please remember this date.
Next is Eurasian Dialogue Institution, followed by Tajik Center for Human Rights.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you have already seen, the refugees in Tajikistan are increasingly numerous in Europe. The state delegation and their fake representatives of civil society, every time they speak, repeat that we are extremists and terrorists. But believe me, with this policy of terror against its own citizens, many citizens have to leave the country, and it's going to continue. I'm afraid that this is going to continue unless they change their policy in pushing out their own people out of the country. With regard to immigrants compared to the population, Tajikistan is one of the leading countries of donor of migrants. There are many reasons for this. I believe the main reason is that there's a lack of freedom and the limitation of general civil rights. In our country, we do not have the elemental right to freedom. But the government wants to convince themselves and others that the only reason for this massive migration is economic. Yes, the majority of our migrants are labor migrants, but unfortunately, our citizens in Russia, the main country of destination, also do not have their elemental rights supported. Our citizens don't even have access to medical care, and the inflow of Tajik citizens into Russia is also growing. And we also even when we are in Europe, we are under pressure from Tajikistan. They are also putting pressure on our relatives so that we do not have the chance to even say the truth here. You have all become witnesses to how the government reacts to our statements at this conference. Tariq Malizuda, until recently, was the ombudsman in Tajikistan. If this institution reacts in this way, what can one say about the prosecutor's office and the security offices? In Europe, we are also having a hard time. Many people who are under threat to life and health in their countries are also sometimes don't have a great deal of time to assimilate into society, are also threatened. My recommendations. Now, for many years at this conference, we have people who speak none of the OSCE working languages. I should suggest that Tajikistan and the OSCE should pay attention to this fact. To the EU, I think that you should pay more attention to the cases of Tajiks seeking asylum in your countries. You should also put pressure on Russia to improve the situation of Tajik labor migrants.
Next is Tajik Center for Human Rights, followed by Barnabas Fund.
Vielen Dank, Herr Moderator. Sehr geehrte
Thank you very much, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Suleiman Aziev. I lived in Tajikistan for 10 years. After that, I lived abroad. Do you know why I don't live in the country of my birth? The thing is, I don't feel comfortable living there. I don't find it agreeable. No one lets me get on with it. Everyone tries to take my decisions for me. That cannot be called a life. I can't live like that. There are laws. When we talk about the president, well, we say that he's a Wahhabite, he's a Salafist, and many other similar.
Tajikistan.
Thank you very much, moderator. We'd be most grateful if you could ask the speaker to stick to the topic at hand. I know that the distinguished delegates of Tajikistan wanted to say that, but I don't want them to interrupt.
Resolve the point of order. Thank you.
Dank u.
The point of order is duly noted.
Okay.
I encourage the speakers to try to stick to the topic at hand. Thank you.
Kein Problem. Thank you, Herr Moderator.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This is why everyone is trying to flee Tajikistan and make a life for themselves elsewhere. In Tajikistan, I did not belong to any political party. I wasn't involved in politics at all. I did want to comment on a number of issues, but I was not allowed to do that when I was living in Tajikistan. There are 9 million people living in Tajikistan. 3.5 million live outside the country on top of that figure. This means that there is no freedom in Tajikistan, especially no freedom of religion. What's most important is that you cannot express your opinion there, and I can confirm that. We need to help one another. We need to speak the truth. For instance, all those living outside Tajikistan say that they don't want to return to Tajikistan because the violence is so pervasive. By way of conclusion, I want to say that no one flees their country without good reason for doing so. Do I have a few seconds left? Very well. I also wanted to... Mr. Moderator, once again, we wanted to ask the speaker to clarify who they're representing here. You do not have the right. You do not have the right. Tajikistan. We're not in Tajikistan. We're at a conference, so it's up to the moderator to decide.
It is up to the moderator, so
No, okay.
just give me a moment to resolve. Excuse, just a minute. Thank you. Sorry, could you repeat that because I didn't catch all of it? Thank you.
Who is the speaker representing? What organization do they represent?
Sir, please, just one moment. Point of order is noted. The speaker has registered as the Tajik Center for Human Rights. Please continue. You have 22 seconds. Excuse me.
There's no family, there's no person with that name registered under that organization. There's no member on the list with that name.
If you could just give us a moment then for a technical break. Thank you. I can't see that far, but we will look into it and get right back to you. Thank you.
Okay, vielen Dank. Noch 22 Sekunden. Okay.
Thank you very much. 22 seconds, is that right? I'm almost done.
Please wait. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. To the point of order, ODIHR has checked the badge of the speaker, which represents both the person's name and the center that is listed at the registration. We are going to consider that sufficient facts. The point of order is duly noted, and the speaker will continue. We will grant 27 seconds because of some loss of time in the back and forth, and then the time will be concluded. Thank you.
Vielen Dank nochmal, Herr Moderator.
Thank you once again, Mr. Moderator. At the end of my statement, I want to say the following. In Tajikistan, the situation is terrible. It's a dictatorship. What we are striving for is first to have a democratic republic. Yes, we also want freedom for all prisoners of conscience in Tajikistan, and we want to free all political prisoners in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a point of order, or is it retracted?
We would be grateful to you if the moderator would react to such instances in good time. Thank you. Please don't interrupt me.
Thank you. Next is Barnabas Fund, followed by Tajikistan.
Mark Green from Barnabas Fund. Treatment of Christians and other religious minorities in the asylum process system. Barnabas Fund requests that OSCE countries recognize the persecution of Christian minorities and the particular threat that converts usually face in many contexts, and take a proactive policy when dealing with asylum claims. 2, carry out a needs assessment of the specific issues faced by religious minorities within their refugee populations in order to ensure that they adequately meet their duty to protect. 3, develop a specific strategy to protect religious minorities who are refugees in their country from religiously motivated violence coming from other refugees. And 4, work with UNHCR to investigate why the number of referrals from some groups in some areas is suspiciously low. Barnabas Fund remains concerned about the treatment of Christian refugees and asylum seekers in OSCE countries and the apparent discrimination in certain contexts. There is almost a tendency to ignore the context of sectarian violence meted out to Christians and other minorities, for example Yazidis in parts of the Middle East, Africa and Asia, especially at the hands of insurgents, terrorist groups, jihadist fighters or repressive regimes. The extremely low numbers of religious minorities given asylum in some contexts is a concern. We've previously highlighted that both in the USA and in the UK, Christians make up less than 1% of Syrians given asylum in recent years, even though they represent about 10% of the Syrian population. This is despite the fact that there is a general recognition that Christians and Yazidis face virtual genocide in some areas of the Middle East. The British and Foreign Commonwealth Office recently held a high-profile review into the persecution of Christians globally. It would be useful if they could influence their colleagues in the Home Office to improve their often harsh approach to Christian asylum seekers escaping violent persecution. OSCE member states could also beneficially review policies and improve the current situation where Christian asylum seekers are often treated in the same context as asylum seekers from other groups that have been persecuting them back in their home countries. All those countries represented here who've sent genuine converts back to countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Mauritania, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and Somalia need to be aware that there is often a death sentence for apostasy enshrined in the criminal law system. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Tajikistan, followed by Reformist Youth Public Union.
Thank you very much, distinguished Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Tajikistan is a participant of a range of international covenants in the area of combating human trafficking, including the UN Convention on Combating Human Trafficking, Exploitation and Prostitution, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, etc. in taking account of the issues at hand, we became part of the global process of combating human trafficking, and we have taken national and international measures. So the government of Tajikistan respects the minimal standards on the elimination of human trafficking and has made enormous efforts on this front. The status of our country was raised to level 2 thanks to our efforts. This means that we have taken on the monitoring and financial responsibility for the victims of trafficking and the upgrading of our laws. Now, the Tajik children from Iraq and Syria have become enormous victims to human trafficking. Together with the civil society, we have elaborated and assessed laws on human trafficking and elaborated a national action plan together with them. The government has also broadened the law enforcement measures to combat human trafficking. In January 2012, we passed amendments to the criminal code, and it was broadened. So now it is applied to all cases of trafficking of children with regard to any type of force or abuse. This amendments give us greater scope to deal with this problem in cases where children are adopted and exploited. We also have efforts to help victims. In 2016, we started also to assist victims, and we have created an interagency commission. The government decree from March of 2012 has approved a new action plan on combating human trafficking up to 2021. Measures have been taken to combat human trafficking have yielded positive results, and there has been a drop in the number of crimes involving human trafficking. Law enforcement, together with NGOs and other agencies, provide a constant advisory and legal assistance to victims. Based on our laws, we are going to continue our efforts to combat human trafficking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next is Reformist Youth Public Union, followed by, next is Azerbaijani Community of the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, but first let me address the point of order that was raised. The issue has been investigated by ODIHR, and we have determined that the person speaking or down there who was about to speak is speaking in the capacity in which he is registered. We're going to allow him to speak. The point of order is noted, and we will proceed. In which he is registered.
Order?
Point of order noted.
But in the list of participants, which is distributed to the delegations, he appeared in the list of the delegation of Azerbaijan. If there are corrections to the list of participants, we have no problem with that. We appreciate the participation of NGOs as long as they are speaking in the status they have been registered in.
Thank you. The point of order is noted, and the person has 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants of this very important session, we have seen blatant effort by the representative of Armenia to silence the Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, as if it was not enough for Armenia, who occupied, invaded, and massacred the Azerbaijanis in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And I am, as the head of the Azerbaijani community, who have been, together with my fellow members of the community, who have been expelled, and we have been subjected to ethnic cleansing by Armenia, and now we are seeing another effort by the Armenia to silence our voice even here in the center of the democratic country, in the OSCE headquarters, ODIHR headquarters. It's unbelievable. So if the representative of Armenia has some problems with sight symptoms, I show her my badge, which is written here and which was published by the OSCE ODIHR implementation meeting.
If the speaker could return to the topic of the session, that would be fantastic.
So my name is Tural Genjaliev, and I represent more than 80,000 strong community of Azerbaijanis from Nagorno-Karabakh who have been expelled as a result of the Armenian military aggression. We have been living already for 30 years as IDPs, and we have been waiting for 30 years when we are going back to our native lands, because our lands are occupied. We have been deprived of exercising our basic human rights. We cannot return to our properties. We cannot return to our homes. Even we cannot visit the graveyards of our family members who are now under the occupation of Armenia. So my grandfather's, my grandmother's graveyards are in Nagorno-Karabakh region. I myself, I was born in 1980 in the city of Shusha, Nagorno-Karabakh, and when I was 12 years old, Armenian military occupant forces invaded and occupied the city. So the only possible solution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is the peaceful solution of both Armenian and Azerbaijani communities together within the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. There is no another solution. So I call upon the international community, international organizations to put more pressure on Armenia to call Armenia to withdraw its troops from Azerbaijan's international recognized territories. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Reformist Youth Public Union is next, followed by Association of Tajik Youth in the Russian Federation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Zenfira Aliyeva, Reformist Youth Public Union from Azerbaijan, Karabakh. The issue that discussed here today regarding the situation of refugees and displaced people is the leading problem that disturbs the whole world. The Republic of Azerbaijan, which I represent, has been facing the reality of refugees and displaced people for almost 30 years. In consequence of Armenia occupying 20% of Azerbaijan's territories and massacring over thousands of people, more than 1 million Azerbaijani citizens became immigrants and refugees by being displaced from their own land with inhumane methods. Also, my relatives was massacred by Armenian soldiers. They violated the war rules and killed babies, children, and women. Due to challenging social and economic circumstances in the first year of the occupation, in a period when Azerbaijan had just achieved its independence, around 1 million immigrants and displaced people were forced to live in tents under very severe conditions. In that conditions, food and healthcare opportunities were unsuitable, and several immigrants lost their lives as a result of these difficulties. Although their problems are solved by Azerbaijani government under today's conditions, these people still cannot return to the homes they were born. And today, 2 civilians, Dilgam Askarov and Shahbaz Guliev, who wanted to visit the graves of their families, were taken hostage by Armenian, which is under severe tortures. On the same topic as my current residence country, Turkey has also been facing the problem of refugees for many years. Despite the world's ignorance, Turkey has embraced over 3 million Syrians who were harmed due to the war in Syria. I invite all the countries to take real action on these ignored issues. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would just like to remind all participants, please no photographs, no video, please, without explicit permission. Thank you. Next is Association of Tajik Youth in Russian Federation, followed by Salute et Miséricorde.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Moderator, Tajikistan is a democratic country. It's part of the international community, the globalized community, and we also see integration processes underway in our country. One of the signs of globalization is the fact that there's the free movement of people from one country to another. The roots of these migratory processes can be traced back to a bloody civil war. As a result, we had a political crisis followed by an economic crisis. During the Civil War, over 150,000 people died. Over 1.5 million people were forced to flee the country. Once the war ended and the situation stabilized, the political leadership did everything within its power in order to bring those refugees back home. Today, the Civil War is behind us. Nonetheless, we are still rebuilding following the war. Many of our migrants have moved to Europe. This happened after the migration rules in Russia were toughened. Getting a work visa to Europe was fairly easy. Even unqualified migrants managed to move to Europe, get a visa and move to Europe and get a job. Many of those who didn't manage to get a visa thought they would make the most of the humanism of European countries and seek asylum, achieving refugee status. I must say that there are some companies, intermediaries, who grease palms and help anyone and everyone to get refugee status. Recently, a human rights defender, Jadro Kurbaiba, head of a civil society organization, Plamene Srca, published a report about the fact that the Islamic Renaissance Party often forges support letters for those seeking a European visa. She even contacted the UN Commissioner for Refugees, High Commissioner for Refugees, about this. Many of those behind the scheme belong to the Islamic Renaissance Party. They took the money, and a lot of this money was funneled to Poland. And in fact, the leader, the henchman behind this, lives in Poland. And many people involved in this scheme are here at the OSCE. They don't want their voices to be heard. They want to lobby to promote their business. Our recommendations are the following. We want you to double-check everyone who registers here to ensure that none of them represent, in fact, terrorist organization. We want to stop the Islamic Renaissance Party from earning money on the back of this. We also want migration cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Salute Misericord, followed by George.
I'm from the Association de l'Amérique, which deals with interreligious relations. My recommendation concerns the specific means that must be undertaken to resolve the problem faced by Christian asylum seekers, especially those who converted from Islam, when their applications are treated by officials who are Muslim, whether this is within the European country administrations or by international institutions. For example, a very well-known case, in order to provide asylum in certain independent cases, the agents of Her Majesty the Queen did not accept the reasons for conversion. Some even quoted from the Old Testament to justify their decision and to conclude that some of these verses counter your affirmation that you converted to Christianism because it would be a religion of peace, as opposed to Islam, which is nothing but violence, hate, and vengeance. Now, does an administrative official have to use the Sharia or the guidance of the bureau for which they work? A former Iranian Muslim saw that her asylum request was refused, justified by the following. In your meeting, you said that Jesus is your savior, but you explained that he was not able to save you from the Iranian regime. You believe, thus, that your religious conviction is not well-founded and that your faith in Jesus is lukewarm. Interviewed on Radio 4 BBC, this Iranian woman who wanted to remain anonymous stated, after I converted, the Iranian state launched an international wanted list against me, and I wanted to flee Iran. In my country, if someone converts to Christianism, they must be executed because Allah commands from the Quran, if they turn away, you must seize them and kill them wherever you find them. So, rejecting the request for asylum of a Christian convert from Islam means that it's sending them to their death for apostasy. On the other hand, European countries have no qualms in taking in tourists and to deliver them visas, as well as to preachers of the Quran and hatred, where we see human rights are at the service of those who are set out to destroy them. My recommendation, I invite the ODIHR to provide tangible means to swiftly put an end to this unfair discrimination if possible, and if not possible, to recognize that denying the fact that Islam
Inspired. We would welcome all speakers to offer their recommendations early on in the intervention so we can make sure to document them. Next is Georgia, followed by Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to update the distinguished audience on the recent developments in the occupied regions of Georgia and on the situation of IDPs. Starting from the early 1990s, ethnic Georgians have become the victims of several waves of ethnic cleansing, and now several hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees are deprived of their right to safe and dignified return to their homes. Apart from this reality, the turning of event indicates that the situation is only going to worsen, and we are likely to see more IDPs and refugees from the Russia-occupied Abkhazia and Tskhinvali regions. Since the military aggression of Russia against Georgia in 2008, Russia has been trying to isolate the occupied regions from the rest of Georgia and remove Georgian traces as a part of the active policy of forced Russification. Occupied Abkhazia and Tskhinvali regions of Georgia have been actively militarized by Russia since 2008. Military bases illegally stationed in both regions with thousands of military personnel coupled with regular large-scale military drills instill sense of deep fear in the local residents. Russian occupation regime in Tskhinvali continues installation of razor and barbed wire fences and other artificial barriers along the occupation line, depriving people of the access to the private property, homes, gardens, agricultural lands, and religious sites. Quite recently, on August 7, Russian FSB troops entered the territory controlled by the Georgian government and launched the process of erection of artificial barriers. The fences cut through the houses of locals. The families had to leave their houses and join the huge part of Georgian IDPs. Regular restrictions to the freedom of movement is a hard pressure on conflict-affected people. Tskhinvali occupation regime arbitrarily closes the so-called crossing points. Just recently, on 4 September, the Russian occupation regime closed the crossing points for an unidentified period of time, fully isolating occupied region and further aggravating humanitarian and socio-economic conditions of conflict-affected people. We urge the international community to continue pushing the Russian Federation to provide unrestricted access to the occupied regions of Georgia and comply with 12 August 2008 ceasefire agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just been notified that due to the amount of time that remains, we will have to ask all remaining speakers to limit their intervention to 2 minutes. I remind delegations that this will protect the amount of time for to preserve a right of reply period and also allow us to end on time due to the fact that the interpreters must stop at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Next is Russian Federation, followed by Armenia.
Thank you, moderator. Right at the outset, I do want to say that we're somewhat baffled that we've changed the speaking time each delegation gets in the middle of the meeting. We believe that everyone should get the same amount of time. So, if I may, let me say the following, that the topic of this meeting is multifaceted. It's very difficult to cover all the points in such a short time, but we do want to, therefore, turn straight to the recommendations, as you asked. First of all, we believe that in order to combat migratory problems which have cropped up in the OSCE region, we need to, first of all, create opportunities for legal migration flows to take place. Second, we need appropriate conditions for migrants in temporary detention centers and facilities, providing access to healthcare. Third, we need to take into account the special needs of women and children, stopping any violence against them. Next, we need to swiftly reunite children refugees with their parents or relatives, and if possible, if that's not possible, give them guardians, assign them with guardians or representatives. We also wanted to note that refugees and migrants are most vulnerable to being exploited by traffickers. The migratory situation is very complicated, especially in Southern Europe. People are facing horrific conditions in their home countries and are dying by the thousands at sea and on land. Those who do manage to chart a perilous course across the Mediterranean are often resorting to using the services of illegal escorts, and they often fall into the hands of exploiters. This is happening in the US and Europe. Over the last few years, in the U.S., on the U.S.-Mexican border, a number of families died. Some of them had young children and infants. Many international organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, frequently call on the U.S. government to pay attention to what's going on there. And I will send a full version of the text to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Armenia, followed by Set My People Free.
Thank you, moderator. Firstly, it's good to note that corresponding changes have been made to the list of participants, and the person in question has been listed as a civil society representative. Human rights are universal and should be applied to all equally without any discrimination. There can be no distinction of any kind, including the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. Therefore, limitations imposed on people living in conflict areas which deprive them from international protection contradict the spirit and the letter of international human rights law. For decades, the population of Nagorno-Karabakh has been subjected to those limitations and constantly facing the risk of extermination. The atrocious assault on their physical security in the early 90s by Azerbaijan, the repeated aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh in April 2016, caused the pressing urgency of the recognition of the human security and rights of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and the necessity of the humanitarian access of UNHCR and other respective international bodies. Despite the hardships our country has been experiencing, including its lead borders blockade, Armenia has made significant efforts to assist with the mass influx of refugees since the very beginning of the conflict and created all conditions for their integration. In this regard, it should be underlined that durable solutions for displaced populations, such as local integration, should not be subjected to political manipulations. Armenia also demonstrated an international burden-sharing approach towards more than 20,000 persons displaced from Syria seeking protection in Armenia during 2012-2018. In this context, it is important to mention that the comprehensive strategy on integration of forcibly displaced persons and reintegration of returning Armenian citizens is currently in the process of elaboration. And concluding this topic, we would like to submit the following recommendations to the OSCE and its institutions to continue strong focus on the human rights of persons residing in conflict areas in their agendas. Second, to facilitate humanitarian access of UNHCR and respective UN special procedures to the refugees and displaced persons in conflict zones, upholding the principles of universality of human rights and our collective commitment of leaving no one behind. And to the participating states, undertake all measures for local integration of refugees and internally displaced persons and refrain from manipulations of the issue for purpose of gaining political dividends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Set My People Free, followed by Center of Political Analysis and Forecasting, Crimea.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Set My People Free would like to make the following recommendations. We encourage an increase in resettlement spots as a durable solution with a priority for survivors of violence who face continued persecution in the country that they choose to flee to. And also to train migration workers in the vulnerabilities of ex-Muslims, including converts, atheists, and religious dissenters. And we recommend that they follow the UNHCR guidelines on how to conduct these interviews, respect the asylum seekers' preference of interpreter to ensure that the individual feels comfortable to share their story and without prejudice. Also, not to question the choice of the individual to believe or not to believe, but ask questions on how they came to their decision and how they practice their new belief or non-belief. And Set My People Free agrees with the recommendations made by ADF International and other civil society members, and would like to mention also Sweden and Finland, as also we've met concerning cases and how they have dealt with convert cases as well. Amongst others, there was an interpreter who, when the person was saying that when the convert was explaining that they say the prayer, Our Father, they translated to protect me from to not lead me into temptation. They said, don't lead me into traffic accidents. So there needs to be interpreters who know the language as well. That's very important. And we would like OSCE countries to consider expediting the cases of ex-Muslims, as many face and risk refoulement back to their home countries. Amongst others, we have a case in Egypt where a Sudanese was returned to Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Center of Political Analysis and Forecasting Crimea, and next followed by Crimean Tatar Resource Center.
Dear Chairman and representatives of the participating states, I want to emphasize the urgency of risks and challenges connected with human dimension issues for Ukrainian labor migrant workers of maritime sector. More than 100,000 of them are working crew members of vessels flying over under flag of convenience all around the globe, but also in Black and Azov Sea, being the highest risk of trafficking. Today we discussed this on side event threats for human dimension issues in maritime sector, Ukrainian example, directly related to the reports, and I'm cordially grateful for the attention done to this issue. Participants of events strongly recommended for OSCE to pay more attention on risk and challenges in area of safety and human dimension in maritime sector, especially in Black and Azov Sea in condition of ongoing Russian aggression and state conflict, to enforce the capacities and strengthen the will of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for reflecting the situation in Ukrainian maritime spaces, as it is undeniable part of this mission mandate. As Ukraine is the only country with quantity of such migrants still not ratified Maritime Labour Convention 2006 due to relevant corruption influence from the illegal human traffic business. We hope that Ukrainian government team will be more attentive to this issue. Also, we hope that current negative policy of the Ukrainian State Fishery Agency, which caused the disappearance of the Ukrainian oceanic state fishery fleet, its gradual transfer during the last 10 years over full control of Russian business that inter alia called the tragedy on vessel Ivan Golubets and many events of trafficking will be immediately stopped. And of course, the situation in labor for Ukrainian maritime sector sharply degraded since 2014 in condition of Russian aggressions against Ukraine, attempt of annexation of the Crimea, occupation of the riparian part of the Donetsk region near Mariupol, full armored control of Russian naval and special forces over the Kerch Strait, and major part of Ukrainian waters of Black and Azov Seas. More than 20,000 Ukrainian seafarers and fishermen in Crimea and occupied part of Donbass became hostages of the aggressor policy, with limited possibilities for obtaining the legal documents and for legal transfer to and from the vessels involved to the global maritime traffic and fishing. Thank you.
Next is Crimean Tatar Resource Center, followed by Azerbaijan.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Tatar people have become a minority in their own homeland due to the genocide policy after the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the total deportation in 1940, the occupation of Crimea in 2014, systemic repressions, arrests and searches, kidnapping and murder are the new policies. We are for the protection of the people of Tatar. The Crimean Tatars are displaced as the supposedly unloyal population. There are cases opened against so-called sabotage criminals in Tatarstan. Hundreds of thousands have had to leave, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention. Passports are being taken away from people and are being deported. In 2019, there have been 69 arrests. 59 of these are Crimean Tatars, 97 interrogations, 57 are Tatars. There have been also the majority of Crimean Tatars who are being detained in FSB jails are 90% Crimean Tatars. 17 people have been kidnapped, 13 of which are Crimean Tatars. 18 were killed. 12 of these are Crimean Tatars. There are systemic repressions as well. I cannot live in my own home due to the court decision. I was condemned for speaking at the OSCE. Other people have been detained and judged in absentia. We would like to support ethnic peoples in the OSCE region. The Russian Federation needs to apply the law and as an occupying power that has full control over Crimea to free 100 political prisoners in Crimea, to stop forced disappearances in Crimea.
Has expired. Next is Azerbaijan, followed by Independent Center for Human Rights Protection.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Fuad Husseinov, Deputy Minister for Affairs of Refugees and IDPs. Distinguished guests, distinguished delegates, let me first start by transmitting a question which is posed by tens of thousands of IDPs on a daily basis. When are we going back to our native lands of origin, and why international community is still turning a blind eye towards restoration of our fundamental rights to return? Azerbaijan's sensitivities to IDP's cause is clearly understandable as a country which hosts in per capita terms one of the highest caseloads of refugees and IDPs in the world. And displacement in my country is a consequence of ongoing military aggression and occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 adjacent districts, which led to displacement of nearly 1 million of civilians. Azerbaijani state, following requirements of UN guiding principles on internal displacement, has set an exemplary model for dealing with large-scale displacement. However, the only durable solution for protracted displacement, as stated also by UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights of IDPs, rests with their inalienable right to return in dignity and safety, pending settlement of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Frankly, with the change in Armenia, there were hopes for a more constructive approach towards this issue. However, recent destructive and provocative statements by Armenian leadership, quote, Nagorno-Karabakh is Armenia, full stop, unquote, clearly demonstrates that Armenia's real aim is occupation, annexation, which is skillfully hidden behind the curtain of so-called right to self-determination, and puts the region face-to-face with the new threats and risks, intentionally escalating the situation to divert public attention from domestic issues. Such calls for accession of occupied Azerbaijani territories must be considered as irresponsibility and disregard for international community, and particular for OSCE Minsk Group. And let no one doubt that Azerbaijan will restore its territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders allow its civilian population to return. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Independent Center for Human Rights Protection, followed by United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Sheridamatova, the Independent Center for Human Rights Protection of Tajikistan. I'm speaking on behalf of the civil society of Central Asian countries, which are members of the Central Asian Network tasked with protecting human rights. In Central Asia, of late, we've been paying particular attention to IDPs, people who've been forced to leave their countries. Over the last few years, the governments of Central Asian countries have taken some positive steps so as to reduce the number of IDPs. For instance, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, there were decrees issued and working groups set up which develop legislation in this field. In Tajikistan, a decree was signed by the president and a working group was set up to come up with the new housing code. In other countries, there are other decrees that have been issued so as to provide social protection to these persons. This is, however, not a silver bullet solution. Many problems remain. For instance, not in all countries are there regulations governing IDPs, their situation. The situation with regard to IDPs is almost identical in all of the countries. The problems are very similar, although there are, of course, some national distinctive characteristics. There are campaigns being run with a view to amending the existing regulations. Also, we want further information to be available about the regulations in place in each particular region. We want IDPs to be able to get documents and titles to property. Property, land should be considered as market goods, not as private property. As a result, our organization calls on Central Asian governments to uphold the Constitution and to draw attention to these cases as they are examples of violations of human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is United Kingdom, followed by Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The UK fully aligns with the statement delivered by Belgium on behalf of the EU, and would like to add some comments in a national capacity. Modern slavery and human trafficking is a global problem, complex, multifaceted, and with no respect for borders. In the UK, we estimate there to be between 10,000 to 13,000 potential victims from 130 different countries of origin, including, in fact, the largest group from the UK itself. The UK's national referral mechanism saw a 36% increase in referrals of potential victims in 2018, evidence that the more effective our responses become, the greater our awareness of the sheer scale of the challenge we face. We do not have all the answers, but we offer a few examples of the UK's approach to tackling both supply and demand. Domestically, We've invested significantly in developing the skills of law enforcement to detect and investigate these crimes and to enhance care for victims of modern slavery. We're testing a new national model for independent child trafficking advocates. We want to make sure that this service meets the varied and specific needs of all trafficked children. On the supply side, transparency in supply chains provision in our Act has transformed business culture in the UK. Many senior business leaders are engaged on this issue, and we are committed to creating a new central reporting service to make it easier for NGOs, investors, and consumers to scrutinise the actions that businesses have taken to prevent modern slavery in their supply chains. Internationally, we continue to call for states to join the 89 countries that have already signed up to the call to action to end forced labour, modern slavery, and human trafficking, launched during the UN General Assembly in 2017, and for those states already on board to move to implementation. Building on that call, the UK jointly launched the principles to guide government action to combat human trafficking in global supply chains with the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in September 2018. We also have some recommendations, and it will be on the statement online. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial, followed by Association of Tajiks in Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dear colleagues, I think in the end of the session, I would like to remind about one of the most vulnerable groups of migrants, and this is children. Millions of persons migrate in our region annually, and among them children, traveling either with their parents or alone. Children migrants are being in high risk of detention, separation with their parents, abuses, violence, and trafficking. Unfortunately, inappropriate legislation in the region contributes to the violation of rights of children migrants, and one of such regulations is Chisinau Agreement of the countries of Commonwealth of Independent States on return of children migrants of 2002. The agreement is based on the Soviet child care, which is police care. Based on the agreement, in accordance with the agreements, police detain child migrants in transit detention centers and then return back to the similar police institutions in the countries of their origin. Basically, children are kept in detention for several months or several years until being returned back to their countries only based on their migrant status. This is a clear violation of human rights and children's rights standards. Moreover, the agreement is not politically actual. Some countries, Ukraine and Georgia, is left country, Commonwealth of Independent States. Moreover, the agreement is not in accordance with the national legislation anymore. A number of countries in the regions has refused from the police detention centers. And moreover, the transit centers from the monitoring that we see is economically non-appropriate. So we call the states in the region to work on the new interstate agreements on return of children migrants that would be based on the recommendation of UN committees and that would provide for freedom and dignity of children migrants. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next is Association of Tajiks in Kazakhstan, followed by the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Republic of Azerbaijan.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, distinguished friends, I represent the Association of Tajiks in Kazakhstan. True human trafficking and the position of refugees today is one of the main problems of the international community today. The main reason that they are victims of trafficking is war and instability. In spite of the fact that I live outside of my homeland, I always follow quite carefully about the events happening in Tajikistan. Today, the situation with human rights in Tajikistan, compared to the 1990s, has improved thanks to the efforts of the government of Tajikistan and the president of Tajikistan, Alim Rahman, who has ensured that today all of the refugees of the civil war have returned to Tajikistan. We must also note that as a result of the war in Tajikistan that was imposed by the terrorist organization, the Party of Islamic Renaissance, over 1 million people became refugees. Those who are to blame are the terrorist organizations of the Party of Islam Renaissance, who hide under other names, for example, Paimon or some other small groups. And they discuss this situation of human rights with us at such authoritative meetings. This is what we have reached today. This is what democracy looks today. It's quite puzzling. Tajikistan is developing democratically. We have the freedom of speech. With regard to refugees, I have seen with my own eyes how difficult it was when, in my own homeland, people feared leaving their own homes.
Next is the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Republic of Azerbaijan, followed by Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, the humanitarian community is increasingly aware of the crisis of the refugee and internally displaced persons, which affects over thousands of million people worldwide. The guiding principles of internal displacement, which are based upon existing international humanitarian law and human rights instruments, cover four main protection directions: protection before displacement, protection and assistance during displacement, protection relating to humanitarian assistance, and principles relating to return, resettlement, and reintegration. I would like to note that problems concerning the refugees and IDPs remain as issues priority and concern for Azerbaijan. As a consequence of long-lasting aggression started and regularly continued by Armenia since in 1988, more than 1 million of our nationals were forcibly expelled from their native lands and homes, lost family members' health, also suffered from gross violation of their fundamental human rights. Durable solution of these problems can be achieved when the resolution of UN Security Council and international agreements are taken into consideration. For example, the UN Security Council resolutions number 853, 874, and 884 in 1993 on the Armenian-Azerbaijan Nagorno-Karabakh conflict affirmed the rights of Azerbaijan refugees and internally displaced persons to return to their homes. And as a national human rights institution of Azerbaijan, we make a decisive call to OSCE member states and international organizations and community to consolidate and carry out joint efforts and action aimed at ending the long-lasting Armenian aggression against Azerbaijan, liberate the occupied territories of our country in compliance with the universal international norms, restore the recognized by UN borders and the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan state, to return internally displaced persons to their lands and homes with full enjoying all their human rights. Otherwise, Azerbaijan, in accordance with the UN Charter, can use its rights to protection from aggression and restore the rights and freedoms its citizens. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Next is Austria, followed by right of reply, and the first will be Belgium.
Vielen Dank, Herr Moderator.
Thank you, moderator. Austria would like to associate itself with the statement made by Belgium on behalf of the EU. A couple of points in our national capacity. First and foremost, I want to set forth some recommendations for OSCE participating states. These are initiatives which we've put together. The fifth National Plan of Action out to the year 2020 sets forth new challenges which we must confront, including the migration crisis. It calls for enhanced training courses and other measures to be taken so as to raise awareness of the problem. Now, the plan contains both voluntary measures and compulsory measures which are to be taken by law enforcement officers, the military, the police, the financial intelligence services, and the judiciary as a whole. It also calls for greater cooperation between these bodies and civil society. The plan of action covers a whole host of issues, including those of relevance to human trafficking. We want to be able to pinpoint victims. That's one component. There are also other aspects, such as gender-related issues. These processes call for broad-based participation. This new plan of action, for the very first time, sets forth measures for combating human trafficking and forced labor throughout the supply chain. Now, Austria is using statistical data, up-to-date statistical data on human trafficking. But very often we don't have the latest statistics available, and that's why we have targets in the national plan on coming up with reliable annual statistics. There's a special task force that's been set up to work on collating those statistics. I also wanted to mention, by way of conclusion, that we recently had a report published from OSCE participating state coordinators, and we would like to commend that report. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
We have 12 minutes, 11 minutes, and 12 requests for rights of reply, so there will be 1 minute for each delegation. The first is Belgium, followed by Greece.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to thank Human Rights Without Frontiers for their statement, and I confirm that we will take up under consideration in the elements they have mentioned today. I would like to confirm that in Belgium, any request for asylum, it goes through the is individual and impartial and confidential in line with international laws and the Geneva Convention. The possible denial of a request can also be appealed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Greece, followed by Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank the introducer that I had the pleasure to meet her during ODIHR's and IOM conference in Athens and provide some operational updates about first-level identification of victims in the hotspots in Greece. So since 2017-2018, all services involved in managing the hotspots have made considerable progress in protecting vulnerable population for THP and identify potential victims of THP. For example, since December 2017, a common to all hotspots vulnerability assessment is applied to migrants and asylum seekers under reception identification centers that includes indicators for trafficking in human beings. Professionals have been trained on identifying human trafficking. Trainings have been carried. Child protection officers have been nominated in each reception identification center. All child protection officers receive basic training on human trafficking. Safe zone for unaccompanied minors have been delimited to all reception identification centers and many others. Despite all those measures mentioned, we are aware that the situation at hotspots remains difficult. As total flows in Greece from land and sea borders have increased.
Thank you. I'm sorry, your time has expired. Next is Uzbekistan, followed by Croatia.
Thank you, moderator. I'd like to exercise our right of reply. Could you please turn off the other microphone that's on in the room? In Uzbekistan, we are doing everything to prevent violations and to combat crime, specifically human trafficking. We've taken systemic measures so as to ensure that we effectively combat human trafficking. We ensure that victims get medical, psychological, and other assistance and can reintegrate into society. We've done a great deal of work in order to ensure that there are also regular migration flows. We provide legal assistance and other kinds of assistance to those migrants, and they have, in fact, we have employment agencies, private employment agencies working. The president has set up a national commission which combats human trafficking. The chair of that commission is the Speaker of the Senate. As for specific cases, we'd like to thank Ms. Dovlatova. If she could please send us a list of names. And we've also taken on board the network's recommendation regarding housing.
Next is Croatia, followed by Italy.
Thank you. Since Croatia was mentioned in a statement made by the distinguished representative of the Amnesty International, I would like to respond. Illegal migrations are still one of the biggest challenges for the international community, and in dealing with them, the full protection of human rights of migrants must be secured. In this respect, the Croatian government doesn't allow any form of violence, especially violence against vulnerable people seeking for international protection. In the same context, police officials who are dealing with migrants are obliged to respect their human rights and dignity, and before taking their duty, the police officials have to go through a special training and education program dedicated to the migrants' rights. Regarding the mentioned allegations on the various cases of violence against migrants, we can assure you that all cases were properly investigated and no credible evidence for such allegation was found. Croatian government continues to uphold all required standards of protection of human rights, including protection of migrants, and any wrongdoing will be sanctioned accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Italy, followed by France.
Grazie, signor moderatore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After the very fruitful debate today and after the statements made with regard to asylum seekers who I would like to say that in Italy, the right of asylum is guaranteed by Article 10 of our Constitution. In the specific case of those who are part of the all-powerful God Church and who have obtained the status of refugee between 2011 and 2019, in May 2019, 814 members of this church requested asylum in Italy. 1/3 were rejected, 113 were accepted, and the others are awaiting judgment. The last judgment was handed down by the Perugia court with regard to a citizen of China who is part of the all-powerful God Church. Those who are still awaiting have a residency permit of 6 months, which can be renewed up to the final decision. Thank you.
Next is France, followed by Poland.
Thank you, moderator. I'd like to exercise the right of reply. I'd like to respond to the Church of the Almighty God and Human Rights Without Frontiers, without borders. The right of asylum is granted in line with our law and international law. This is a right guaranteed by the Constitution. France has ratified the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees. On this basis, we consider asylum applications, which we receive. This process is conducted by a body that's independent, and you can appeal the decisions made by this body with all the relevant safeguards in place. In 2018, the requests for asylum, which the Office for Refugee Protection received, stood at over 120,000. That's a 22% increase vis-à-vis the previous year, 2017. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Poland, followed by Tajikistan.
I would like to exercise my right of reply in regard to the statement made by the Tajik political movement Group 24. Poland remains committed to protection of human rights in regard to all group of persons, including asylum seekers. I would like to stress that all cases of asylum seeking are processed by competent Polish authorities in accordance with the binding law, both national and international instruments to which Poland is a party. It's useful to observe that according to available statistics, the numbers of successful applications for asylum submitted from persons previously living in the states of Central Asia is relatively higher when compared to other countries of origin of asylum seekers in Poland. Moreover, in regard to the case of Mr. Mustafa Hayotov, I would like to inform you that the relevant information delivered by Group 24 will be transmitted to the competent Polish authorities for their consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Tajikistan, followed by the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Here we already heard from the representative of Poland on the issue of Mr. Hayot. I also wanted to say that in order to get to European countries, these citizens sometimes join terrorist organizations, including Mr. Hayot, who in 2018 joined the terrorist organization Group 24, and they all want to remain in European countries. This is why they falsify their documents. They even sell their membership tickets to these organizations. I should like to request that the European Union countries to be very objective when they deal with these people and to consider all the documents they submit to them very carefully, especially from citizens who come here. They often come from the Russian Federation. They haven't been in Tajikistan for a long time. To get to Europe, they do everything that they can, all means, in order to get to Europe. This is why. Thank you very much.
Next is United States, followed by United Kingdom.
Thank you. The United States would like to reply to points raised by the Russian Federation. The United States believes that orderly and lawful migration is the best way to protect vulnerable individuals, including women and girls, from the dangers of trafficking and other forms of exploitation and life-threatening situations. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is United Kingdom, followed by Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to respond to the civil society speakers who spoke today on the matter of asylum policy and claims in the UK. Thank you for your interventions, but as you all understand, we're unable to comment on individual cases. Thank you.
Next is Switzerland, followed by Armenia.
Vielen Dank, Herr Moderator. In Bezug auf Asylgesuche. Thank you very much, Moderator. In light of the mention made of Switzerland by the Church of the Almighty God, I want to note the following. All of the requests are considered on an individual basis. We look at the facts and we see whether we can trust the information provided to us. This is what we do when considering refugee requests. Everyone has the right to obtain free legal aid and can also appeal their decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Armenia.
Thank you. Today I've already had an opportunity to introduce the historical sequence of atrocities committed by Azerbaijan against Armenians and the consequences of those genocidal acts, which resulted in more than 400,000 of Armenians expelled from Azerbaijan and war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Today as well, people in Nagorno-Karabakh are exposed to the threat of their physical extermination. Armenia remains the only guarantor of safety and security of the people in Nagorno-Karabakh, which Azerbaijan has neither legal nor moral right to claim over. With regard to the number of internal displaced persons in Azerbaijan, I'd like to reiterate that Armenia had received more refugees per capita than Azerbaijan, but Armenia has never built camps for refugees and created conditions to enable their integration, despite the hard economic situation. If we believe the official statistics of Azerbaijan, the number of displaced population there has been constantly growing, which demonstrates that more than 25 years the rights of those people have been violated, including the right to their integration. But there is another possible option as well. It is very likely that the methodology used by Azerbaijan for the assessment of the number of its displaced population constitutes another deplorable attempt to mislead the international community, thus manipulating the issue for political purposes. Thank you.
Finally, we have Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The speculation of the Armenian side about human rights of people in the conflict zone are nothing but another attempt to distract the attention of the international community from its continued military occupation of the territories of Azerbaijan. No right can be exercised at the expense of the violation of the right of others, in particular the significantly larger Azerbaijani population that was expelled from the Nagorno-Karabakh region and other occupied territories of Azerbaijan as a result of Armenian aggression. To remind, none of the commitments on the human rights protection constitute preferential treatment for any state, group, or person, or may be interpreted as implying any right to engage in any activity or perform any action in contravention of the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and other obligations under the international law, including those relating to sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Coming to the Nagorno-Karabakh, this is the integral part of Azerbaijan. It is recognized as such by the international community, international law, and UN, as well as OSCE decisions. Thank you.
That concludes the right of reply section. We're out of time. The time constraints were lamentable, but I appreciate all participants' patience, their respectful interventions, and their good intentions, and their contributions. I also want to thank Dalia for her excellent introduction, and I hope that she came away with some valuable information in her own work. Finally, I wanted to announce that the Office of the Special Representative will be holding a side event in 15 minutes on technology for NGOs in combating human trafficking. Again, thank you all very much for your contributions. I call the session closed.